This is the operations work group for January 13, 2020. And it marks the beginning of a very important week for us in MMSD in lots of ways, and tonight's going to be a very important discussion. The very first thing we have up is public appearances. We have 3 public appearances tonight. If you haven't spoken before, you can please step up to the front here. There's a microphone with a little green light, and you'll have 3 minutes to speak. I'll time you on this. And Mary Nellis is up first. Barb already got it. Yep.
So I fall into my seat. My name is Mary Nellis. I am a retired teacher from the district. I taught in the district for 34 years. And the first 14 years was at Glendale as a teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing. And the remaining years were as the program support teacher for the deaf and hard of hearing program district-wide. So I continue to be at Glendale on a weekly or more than weekly basis sometimes to support parents, teachers, kids, organize meetings, whatever. And during that time, I was working here in the Doyle Administration Building, so Virginia and I would see each other on a regular basis, aside from the time that we actually worked together at Glendale. She was really instrumental in helping us in the deaf and hard of hearing program because we had parents who were facing major challenges of their kids being identified as deaf and the difficulties that took on. And Virginia was so helpful. She had her PhD in psychology, but she also had a primary focus on early childhood development. That was really crucial when the state ordered that children from centers were eligible to receive services in public schools. And the children who were very physically, mentally, and medically involved severely came to Glendale School. And this was not without problems because staff was felt they were totally unprepared to deal with this. And Virginia really eased the way so that those children could be accepted in the program. The teachers who were working with them were also supported by the rest of the staff. It became a total buy-in with a very positive transition. When I was asked to participate on the Citizens Renaming Committee, I came with that appreciation for all that Glendale has meant to me and others, but also as a person who admired Virginia for what she's contributed to Glendale, and also an admiration for her contributions on behalf of children and parents. The character of this woman and what she stood for should live on, and we can honor that by naming Glendale after her. This is an opportunity to keep alive what she stood for in her actions as well as her advocacy. Virginia spent her whole professional life dedicated to improving children's welfare and their educational opportunities. I speak for myself and members of this committee and other organizations who are supporting this, that to honor her is not just the renaming of the school, but working to give students and faculty informational, personal stories and awareness of how she lived her life so that you can understand what she stood for and learn from her, even though she's not here.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you. Cheryl Cato?
Good evening. My name is Cheryl Cato. I am the director of the Rainbow Project, which is a child and family counseling and resource clinic, and I'm also here representing Women in Focus. This is a service organization that's committed to raising funds to provide scholarships for students of color, and also has initiated the Literacy Project, working as volunteers with the children and their moms at the YWCA. There are many other organizations that are supporting this, including the Wisconsin Women of Color Network. But I wanted to just talk a little bit about the relationship that the Rainbow Project has had with both Glendale and with Virginia Henderson. And last year we gave Glendale an award. The Rainbow Project gave out an Extra Mile Award. The Rainbow Project works with children who've experienced trauma, and these are young children and their families. We've worked with nearly 15,000 children since 1980. And I belong to the Children's Mental Health Collaborative. And I think it's important to think about the science today and how it has really shown that the trailblazers like Virginia Henderson now has science to show that academic performance is linked to resolving trauma, that community partnerships need to happen in the schools. And I know that in 2002, I belonged to the Children's Mental Health Collaborative and worked with many leaders to start that going, but Virginia was way ahead of the times. And so bringing the two together, Glendale School is exceptional in working with students of color and those with special needs, as well as Virginia's leadership really was kind of a wonderful combination and a win-win. It may not be easy because the children I work with who go to Glendale are very proud of Glendale, but I think in the end, knowing more about Virginia, they will really understand and be inspired by the school that's named after her. I think that kind of academic performance is something that we've seen already with children who've gone to the African American Academy. That new information at the University of Minnesota talking about cultural history of trauma is an impact that we've seen every day with children that we work with, those 15,000 children. So I'm supporting that, and I'm honored to be on the committee. Be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Rafael Gomez.
Good evening. You tell me when to start.
You can start anytime.
Very well. I was hired by the Madison Metropolitan School District as a counselor 35 years ago. I'm retired, and this is my third year as a retired person. I had the pleasure to work under Dr. Virginia Henderson when she was the chief director of the Equity Achievement Program for minority students under Superintendent Will Hoy. That was one of the departments that was set up to make a difference in student achievement. Virginia was an advisor to Dr. Wat Hoy, and she had 2 principals directing the program and 8 individuals going to the field and making sure that something is done. Virginia and I come from different training. I come from a training in linguistics, philosophy, and counseling, emphasis in clinical and educational. Virginia comes from psychology in 1954 and 53, which was very different to the time that I took my degree in psychology. If you remember that time, most of the people who were mentally ill, they were going to the mentally ill hospital. I came in after that, when everybody that was mentally ill was coming to the communities. And it was a booming area in psychology and psychotherapy. But what we have in common is pedagogy. Virginia got her master's in psychology and then got a psychology in curriculum and instruction, which embraces 2 pedagogy. And that means to develop a pathway of learning for every student, regardless of color, race, or creed. And Virginia was very passionate about that. And that was part of the conversations we had over and over again. How can we open the road for our students who needed an opportunity? She supported me in developing the Poetry Jam group in all middle schools for girls and letting them voice their opinion. She supported me to develop a program addressing youngsters who were scoring lower than a 2.0 in the school to raise their GPA up. Virginia was an advocate for everyone and to recognize every student with an opportunity to reach their highest capacity. She went out of her way. She was a listener. And therefore, I would like to rename Glendale Common Cooperative to Virginia Henderson.
Thank you. That is the end of our public appearances today. The first thing on the agenda before we actually get into the topics for tonight is an update on the superintendent search. We have 3 candidates coming to join us in Madison this week, which we are very excited about. The schedule for the days is actually online. So the website for the superintendent search is mmsd.org/superintendent search, right? Okay. And we have very, very full days. So the days start out with time with senior staff, with principals. We move on to lunch with students, spend some time with the board, and there are a number of school visits during the day to some of our high schools and our elementary schools as well. So we're excited about that. And the evenings, there's a public forum, which is open to all, as well as on Facebook Live. Did I forget anything? Is there anything else?
I think you got it.
All right. Good.
I have a lot of questions. Will the live stream be available in the Facebook Live after the event for those who couldn't watch it at the
Yes.
same time?
Yes.
Yep.
Hmm?
It'll be
Okay.
it'll be a YouTube video.
It'll be a YouTube video? Thank you.
Cool. All right, so that's that brief update. And then we have 3 topics on the agenda tonight. The first is scheduled to be referendum planning. The second is around budget timeline. And then the last is actually around the proposal for renaming Glendale. Are you guys okay if we move that discussion up to be first, since I know there's a number of folks in the audience that are interested? I don't think so, no. We just need to be okay with it. So, okay, so let's table that one first. Jane, do we have a kind of introduction to that, or?
Thank you. I'd like to introduce Noah Ray and Mary Gavronson, who are co-chairs of the Citizens Naming Committee. If you guys remember, the proposal came to you and it was made public November 24th. It started a 30-day comment period as per policy. And Noble and Mary were then part of the naming committee that you guys named on December 9th. And they were named co-chairs. And they have been following that policy and meeting and proceeding to bring us this recommendation tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to them.
Okay. Well, good evening. First of all, we appreciate the opportunity to do a brief presentation on the Citizens Naming Committee that you impaneled on December 9th. But the first order of business is to provide you with our recommendation, our formal recommendation, and it reads as follows. On July 10th, 2020, the board appointed Citizens Committee for renaming Glendale Elementary School. We unanimously recommend to the Madison Metropolitan School District Board of Education renaming of Glendale Elementary in honor of Dr. Virginia M. Henderson. We believe that Dr. Henderson exceeds all the interests identified in Madison Metropolitan School Board Policy 6700 and is a person that is an outstanding role model for current and future Glendale and Madison Metropolitan students as they study the source of the school's name. The Citizen Naming Committee was appointed by this board on December 9th with the charge of following Board Policy 6700. Comments from a 30-day public comment period and relevant information as needed to make a recommendation regarding the naming of Glendale School. The timeline of this work is attached, and I'm just going to briefly highlight parts of the timeline. And after I finish highlighting part of the timeline, Mary will go through the why, because that's important. So we'll keep it as brief as possible. The timeline is as follows, because it reflects the kind of the procedure and policy that we went through. We actually started this process, as you're well aware of, back in the spring. In the spring, after Virginia Henderson's passing, there began a community dialogue that started to emerge on how Madison could continue to recognize the life and legacy of Dr. Henderson, a prominent and transcendent individual. Early in the summer of 2019, former Chief of Staff Mary Gabronson began to meet with the former Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Cheatham. It is important to note, not only did she meet with Dr. Cheatham, who also supported the recommendation, but she also started to have conversations with the Henderson family, as well as other Chief of Staff of Madison Metropolitan School District. On June 19th of 2019, I was contacted, and that's my first involvement with this, to consider to play a leading role in renaming Glendale in honor of Virginia Henderson. When we started, we had two priorities. One, to expand the community naming committee, which is as per MMSD policy. And second, we wanted to meet with the principal of Glendale School to make sure that we were contacting him. On July 18th, we met with the principal, Principal Ketterer, and explained the proposal. We provided him with both written and verbal background on Virginia Henderson. We also asked if he could refer us to other stakeholders. On August 6th, he reached out to the Neighborhood Association, and we were eventually able to meet with him. This process moved rather quickly. We had a few challenges in the process. There was a change in administration, change in school board, and there was also a change in this policy that we went through. On August 29th, I personally met with then interim Superintendent Jane Belmore and updated her on where we were in the process and provided her with our formal request. So just so you know, we had a Citizens Renaming Committee, the CRC, because later on we're going to have a CNC. September 10th, 2019, we had to call off our neighborhood association meeting for a variety of reasons, and then eventually we were able to meet with them later on. But in between that time, we met with the Citizens Renaming Committee, and this was an important part, because it is per your policy that we have had this committee. And our goal was to get to this. Why Glendale? Why name Glendale Elementary School, Virginia Henderson? And it was kind of summarized into three things. One is Dr. Henderson, as you have already heard, had an impact in the school and had an impact in the community. In terms of the work as she was employed as working at Glendale Elementary. Number two, quite frankly, there's no woman named after an elementary school. And then number three, something that we thought was very important in this, and that is that, as you can tell by listening to the other speakers, Dr. Henderson, her values were consistent with what Glendale Schools, one of their core values, as I mentioned before when I presented here, every adult advocating for every kid, every day, whatever it takes. And we felt that that really reflected Dr. Henderson. So as we progressed on November 6th, I attended the Glendale Neighborhood Association. They had approximately 20 people that were there. Also attending was the neighborhood president. Two Madison alders were in attendance. I discussed a proposal, handed out information. The meeting was very positive. Subsequent to that, the neighborhood association president distributed information on the listserv. And the reason why I'm going through this is to let you know that there is information and has been information ongoing on this for some time. On November 25th, the Madison Metropolitan School Administration sent out a press release that went out from Madison Metropolitan School Board, which was announcing to the community that the school board would be formally dealing with this issue. As a result of this, every major, both broadcast media as well as print media, did a story on this and checking that. Also, you had certain features by community media outlets like Madison 365, as well as Capital City Hughes. All of those are important in ways of demonstrating that the information was out there. On September 2nd, you also held a meeting where there was a public hearing on renaming Glendale Elementary. And then on December 9th, at the request of the principal, I met with I met with the faculty of Glendale School and discussed the proposal. Got a lot of positive comments. That was the same day that you impaneled our committee. On December 20th, we had our first meeting. What we discussed was the mission. We also discussed the timeline and public input. This is how we, in a nutshell, looked at public input. We believe that the entire city of Madison is a stakeholder in Dr. Henderson naming Glendale as Dr. Virginia N. Henderson. But we also know that we have what we refer to as active stakeholders. And those are the people that live in the neighborhood, live in Glendale, as well as go to the school. So our committee decided to focus really on the active, given our time and timeline. Because we knew that we were receiving letters and calls, and the community was sending things into the website. The active stakeholders, we decided to meet at Glendale. We had our first meeting on January 6th, so that the board knows kind of how that meeting went. I'll summarize it very quickly. We had approximately 10 to 20 people that were in attendance. There were minutes taken on all of our meetings. We had public comment first, and then we had a general discussion. The upshot of that meeting is that there was general support for the proposal. Number two, there was concern about our short notice for that first meeting, and that was expressed. The third was the need for faculty and students to get to know more about Dr. Henderson. People were really excited. They want to know more. It's one thing to have a proposal. It's another thing that our work will begin when we help to educate and explain. And then the fourth thing, implementation of a celebration. That when we initiate this, that it was important to think about a celebration in starting this and the cost that may be associated with that celebration. As a result of that, we decided to do three things. One is have another meeting because we had short notice and we wanted to make sure that we were getting the information from our active stakeholders. So we set up a meeting, a subsequent meeting on January 2nd. We also discussed putting together a short video. We also discuss developing informational things that we could put out. In fact, in short order, we had posters made, and this was courtesy of the Gordon Flesch Company as well as the Urban League. They helped put this together in that short period of time. We're having materials distributed in the school. We are working on the Spanish translation of those materials so that the kids will get to know what that means and what it's all about. We were unable to do the video. It was just short notice and we didn't have the ability to do that. Moving forward, on our last meeting, we made our formal recommendation as I presented to you in terms of an action item. We decided a couple of things. One is that it was imperative that, that there is a committee or a group put together, if this is passed, that will help nurture and shepherd in this celebration, that is really key. And so those were the things that we talked about in our last meeting. I will end my outline, which I will submit by saying this, and I think this summarizes the whole thing. We as a committee realize that when you have a school that is named and you're renaming a school, that no matter what, if it's a person or it's a geographic area or whatever it is, that people gravitate to that name. It becomes sacred to them. And we want that. We want our faculty, our parents, our students to really grab a hold of something and become sacred with it. But we also believe that we have an opportunity here, not only to be sacred, but to be inspirational. Looking toward the future, there are principles that this woman lived by, transcendent principles that she lived by. And we think that by naming Glendale School Dr. Virginia M. Henderson, that we will capture both of those things. And we take into account the past in that regard. I will forego going through the list, but by saying that there are a number of awards that we will submit for that Dr. Henderson received for the formal record. I would now like to turn it over to Mary Gill Bronson to summarize the why.
And I will summarize the why, but I'd also like to introduce Dr. Perry Henderson, Virginia's husband, who's here tonight with us. And he's been a wonderful source of information for us. And then some of the committee members that are here tonight, Mary Nellis, who you heard speak, Charles Tubbs, and Cheryl Cotto. And I think that's all that's here tonight that were on the committee, but it was an active committee, so it was fun. So why Virginia? And this I'm trying to reflect what your board policy says and to read back to you why we believe Dr. Henderson fits with board policy 6700. So Dr. Virginia M. Henderson was a prominent local figure who passed in April of 2019. Dr. Henderson dedicated her work to all children, but she had a particular commitment to students of color and those with disabilities. After a brief time at Badger School, she became the school psychologist at Glendale School in 1976 and served in that role for over 15 years before moving to the position of special assistant to the superintendent for equity and diversity. She retired from the Madison schools in 1997. She co-founded the African American Ethnic Academy as well as Women in Focus, a scholarship fundraising organization. Dr. Henderson was also very active with the Madison Children's Museum, the Madison Community Foundation, the Urban League of Greater Dane County, the EBU Foundation, and the Madison Civic Club, and often served on the boards of those organizations. Dr. Henderson received numerous awards for her professional volunteer and personal work to improve the lives of children in the Madison Metropolitan School District and the greater Madison community. And Noble just alluded to that, and we do have a list of all of those awards. She was a respected elder in the Madison community and beloved by the African American community. She and her husband, Dr. Perry Henderson, were active philanthropists in numerous organizations, including including the Madison Rotary Club, where they established a scholarship fund to provide assistance to graduating seniors in the Madison area who have financial need. We believe that honoring an MMSD school by naming it after Dr. Henderson will be a celebratory event for the entire community. The CNC recognizes that renaming an entity with a long history will need special planning, and we are available to assist the renaming committee with the celebration and events that will occur, as was similarly done in 1993 when MMSD renamed 5 middle schools. Henderson Elementary School will be the only MMSD elementary school named for a prominent African American woman, the only one named after a woman, and she, to our knowledge, is the only, will be the only school that recognizes a school support services staff member, which we believe has become very crucial to the operations of the school district. We think this is a cause for great community celebration.
Thank you very much for your presentation and sharing some of the journey of how you got here. At this point, I want to open it up for board discussion and questions. Nikki.
I have one. If the video is made, one, I'd like, let me start over with the mic on. One, I'd like to thank you for your work. Two, she seems like an absolutely wonderful role model and wonderful person. I do recall my grandfather mentioning quite a bit on her when he was a principal. Additionally, if a video is made, can we make sure that a sign interpreter is involved, being that she was an active teacher of the deaf, so that way her legacy can truly be respected for individuals with disabilities. I feel it's a fitting tribute.
Excellent.
I should also comment that one of the people that really instigated a lot of this discussion was one of her caretakers at the end, and her name is Holly Markham. And I don't think she's with us tonight, but she really felt that we needed to recognize Virginia.
I guess I would just like to share, I mean, listening to the story that you just told, aside from Dr. Henderson's own legacy, listening to the path that you've taken is a wonderful example of community-led change. And hearing how much outreach you've done and how much has come from the community is pretty inspirational in and of itself as a district looking to change many things. So thank you for that. I don't know if there's any other questions or comments. Yeah.
Yeah, so I really appreciate that you all organized to do this and brought this before us. I think it's an incredible opportunity for us as a district, and it allows for us to really consider, how our schools are named and who they're named after and who is excluded within that. And so I think that this is a really significant opportunity. I'm proud to get to be part of the group of people that's here while you all pull this together. I do think that in discussing kind of the logistics, it would be really helpful to have a clear understanding of what the cost of renaming a school is, and how the district will absorb that expense, and what it looks like to share that expense with the community moving forward. And so, Jane, I don't know if you wanted to speak to that, or if Kelly was able to speak to.
I think in consult with Chad and Kelly, there will be some cost to the district, but it would be minimal. Basically, in an elementary school, there's probably not as much signage to change as there would be in other schools, so it would be basically that. However, we did have conversations about the things that are important to the students and the parents, the T-shirts, the paraphernalia that they already have that is connected to Topper and Glendale, and so how that transition would be made.
And there is a Glen and there is a Dale, just so you know.
And so the committee did have conversation about that. I don't know if you guys want to talk about.
Yes, that came up in a couple of venues. One is when I met with the faculty. They did bring that up. They did raise that question. Secondarily, it came up on the January 6th meeting again. And so there is, I wouldn't call it necessarily concern, it's just a question as to how this is going to happen. In part because of cost, but also in part because of administratively, if you're working there, what can you anticipate in terms of the changing names, changing information that goes out. So that did come up, and it is a question that I think would be really helpful on the front end if we can frame out in some way, because I think it would put faculty at ease. I think it would put even some parents at ease, to be perfectly honest with you. I also had intended to read this because it is related to the question that you just brought up. This is from Dr. Gloria Billings. She wanted to be here. She wanted to be here, but she's in Florida, but she wanted to weigh in on the naming part and the impact of naming. And it's an email, and the key
My glasses.
no, the key part in this, she has my need her glasses. Key part in this is that in addition to supporting a way to honor a marvelous person, I believe it is important to choose the school names that will have historical significance. A lifetime ago, I was serving as a social studies supervisor in one of the school districts in Philadelphia, 8 geographic areas. I was assigned to create a booklet for the bicentennial 1976, so you would know that was some time ago. I had to research the names of the 44 schools in the area. The schools were named after Germantown, Roxborough, and Central, etc. These are the geographic areas. Had very short write-ups, but those named after people: C.W. Henry, Prince Hall, Martin Luther King, Pretorius, Lindbergh, literally told the story of how our city or persons in interactions with the city. This is something that the board should consider. And what she's getting at is there is a certain resonance that is created when you have a name. This idea of naming the school Glendale, just imagine for a moment that there are books that are written focused at that age level that talks about Dr. Henderson, who met Martin Luther King, who grew up, who faced challenges, and extracting lessons from that. That's what Dr. Billingsley is talking about. It has an impact. And some of the teachers and the faculty, quite frankly, stated that when I met with them.
Thank you. Any other comments? All right, thank you. Dr. Rose, did you?
I just want to share immense gratitude for you to be here. I got a chance to meet Dr. Henderson in 2013. It was a lovely pleasure to hear her story and her commitment to the district. And I hope that we can honor her legacy, not just by the name, but the sentiment around the community, and to continue to push us forward as a district. So thank you very much. And thank you for all the work from the community.
Thank you.
Just before we close, Dr. Rose, I saw you come in late. Did you want to add anything or share anything to the discussion?
Thank you. Just very briefly.
Can you come up to the,
We just want to get it on
Make sure you have a seat.
mic. I don't want anybody to miss what it is.
Thank you. Obviously, the body of work is deserving of recognition, but just in an anecdotal manner, a couple weeks ago, I had the pleasure of meeting a young lady who attended the Saturday Academy. Excuse me, I'm nursing something that I don't want to spread, so please. Yeah, that would be a wise move. And she spoke about her experience, and that was very gratifying. She was saying that she learned Swahili and was able to do things and provide and acquired exposures that she would have never had. Thank you so much. But what really is very cogent to me is that, as we all know, many of our students, they grow up, they have kids of their own. She now has a 9-year-old at Lincoln Elementary School. And she is involved in schools possibly because of her experience through Dr. Henderson. Someone made her feel that she belonged. And now she is working with her son and other children so that they belong. So it has passed forward in a very positive, proactive way for children that look like Dr. Henderson. And I think that that is something that I know is a masthead for many of your actions, the belonging coefficient. And I believe that as you establish this school in the name and more importantly in the spirit of Dr. Henderson, that amazing dividends will be put forth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you to everyone for joining tonight on this topic.
I want to thank you guys for giving us an excellent committee. We were able to do a lot of work really quick with the assistance of Jane, but the committee members that you assembled were excellent. I really do appreciate that.
Thank you. We'll be voting on this on the 27th.
At the end of this month. So. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next section of the agenda. There are two discussions, discrete discussions. The first one up is on the referendum. So Chad, Kelly, Andrew, is your team joining too? Yep. Okay. And the discussion has kind of two parts. So there's a brief intro, which maybe we'll pause after, and then we'll dive into the research piece. So if you can kind of hold your questions.
Good to go.
Yeah, you're good to go.
Right. Good to see everyone again. Long time no see. We are back at it. I'm here to just do a very brief introduction. Kelly's got just a few slides, and then we're actually, as Kate said, the meat of the presentation is actually our research team reporting back on what was over 50 documented sessions that happened primarily in October, November, and a little bit in December, and then a survey that Oriana and Beth's team put together and not only built but administered, and then came up with all of the both qualitative and quantitative data we'll have a chance to go through tonight. I did want to certainly thank primarily Oriana and her team for being along for the ride as Kelly and I, Mike Herding, Mike Hernandez, took it to the streets for the last few months and really had a chance to hear from the community. It was a very informative process. And all of that work out talking to the community, actually having it kind of come to life in this report is so wonderful to see. We're lucky to have this type of skill set on our team in Madison schools. Many times school districts will pay a large dollar amount to get a report put together like this. So I wanted to thank Oriana and her team in advance for the work that they did. Do we have a clicker? All right, so I'm going to run us quickly through what we're hoping to get out of tonight's presentation. So one, we're going to do a quick review of the referendum and our need for community input, kind of where we are and what we've been talking about. And if we have questions about that, we'll certainly take them. Then the meat of the presentation today is to kind of hear about the report, our process, our methods, our findings, and the themes. And then we're interested in school board reaction to all the things that came out of the last few months in terms of that community input phase. And we are excited for the next steps. So as a reminder, our team went out into the community and we took feedback on the possibility of two different questions. One, an operating question to continue that momentum and potentially some of the investments that would be necessary to do so. And Kelly's going to walk us through financials on that in a second. And my part, really I'm the point person for the capital side, the possibility of reinvesting in a few of our sites around the district. So as a reminder, these were the dollar figures that we talked through with all of the folks that we met out in all of these sessions, and really lump these into essentially three categories. So one, a major reinvestment in our 4 high schools. You're all aware of that. And we went through great detail in the time we had out talking to folks in the community. 2, a move to Capitol High, or to a new Capitol High from Capitol East and Capitol West into that Hoyt building. And lastly, a new elementary school on the south side. Talking points we've been using all along, $100,000 in home value. All of our projects on the capital side would potentially have an impact of $69 per 100,000.
So on the facility side, which you'll hear in the feedback that you hear from Oriana in a minute, is as you might expect. As you might expect, when in the community and talking about our 2 potential questions, it's a little bit easier for people to grasp facilities questions, right? It's tangible, it's something you see. And in the case of our high schools, a lot of our community have been in our high schools since they're open buildings that are busy all weekend long. But as we move to the operating question, right, it's operating referendums, historically, wherever you are a little harder to talk about and they're a little harder to understand. School finance is super complicated, for one. And for 2, it's not just as easily as understandable. But this picture is something we've been using for the last couple of months that has seemed to kind of help people understand the need for why an operating referendum question. So this is a picture of our per pupil increase all the way back to 1993, kind of through the Doyle and Thompson kind of administration. School districts were used to small incremental increases primarily tied to inflation for dozens of years. And then what you see is at the beginning of the Walker administration, a clear departure from that reliable, stable source of funding, and rather this idea of the revenue limit becoming a highly contentious topic at the state level, and something that's batted around kind of in the politics versus tying to anything that school districts would need to rely on for a budget, like a cost of living or inflation standard. So what you see starting in 2009, 2010, and forward for the last 10 years is this instability in our overall revenue sources, which ultimately led to, in 2016, the Board of Education at that time going to an operating referendum to exceed the revenue limits. Because what we needed is some stability to get out of the large ebb and flows that we were seeing coming out of the state capitol. And so that 2016 operating referendum ultimately led to this school district maintaining stability for the last 4 years. So we were able to avoid massive teacher layoffs, teacher cuts, and reductions in staff and student programming. And instead, we were able to invest in a number of equity strategies, such as our Grow Your Own program and other student supports, increases in psychologists, increases in the school counselors and social workers, investments that our students most in need needed. So thanks to the 2016 operating referendum, our district's been able to gain a lot of academic momentum. We sit today looking at the 2021 budget, which we'll talk about kind of next tonight. But you'll see the dip for the 2021. Ultimately, for next year's budget, what we're looking at is an $88 per pupil less in next year's budget than we saw in this year's budget. And in addition to that, there is no new operating referendum authority because that 2016 operating referendum expires as of this year. So that's kind of the why behind the operating referendum question. So you all asked us to go out in the community and consider what the feedback was from the community based on potentially asking for $8 million in the 2021 school year, $8 million in the 21-22 school year, $10 million in the 22-23, and $10 million in the 23-24 school year. You saw this slide back before we went in out to the community to validate that these were the numbers we were going to be getting some feedback on. So I want to re-ground ourselves back in these budget numbers because a lot of the feedback you saw kind of relates to this conversation. So the blue bars in this chart are what our assumptions would be around revenue limit authority moving forward for the next year. So if we don't do anything on the referendum ballot at all, the blue bar is what we estimate you'll see and likely impact on the average home over the next 4 years. The orange bar on top is the facilities referendum, the $315 million potential ask that Chad primarily led the conversations in the community on. Facilities referendums it's a bond. So you take out a loan and you pay it off over 20 years. At the end of 20 years, it's fully paid off and there's no more tax impact. The orange bars are making an assumption that we'll make a few larger payments in the first 3 years, and then we stabilize at the 158 that you see right there, kind of for the next 15 years or so as the bond continues to pay off, and then it's gone by the time you hit your claim. Operating, however, is a little bit different. In reoccurring operating referendums like we're talking about, you build the base. So, an $8 million, if the board were to receive the authority from the local taxpayers, and if the board were to choose to ultimately tax for it, you wouldn't have to. If that decision was made, it looked like about $77 for the average homeowner in that year of 2021. When you go to 21-22, the $77 rolls forward to the next year because it's reoccurring. So it moves forward, and then you add another $8 million on top, leaving it as a total impact in 21-22 as $155. The year prior rolling forward, and the impact of the new $8 million in the second year of the referendum. That then happens again for year 3 when you layer in the $10 million. That rolls forward for year 4 if you were to layer in the next $10 million. So by the time you get to the 23-24 year, you've accumulated, if you've levied for it all, the $36 million in total by 23-24, which by that moment in time would be $346 for the average home impact in that year. With no new operating referendum authority after that, that $346 theoretically stays in the base in the future. It doesn't go away after 20 years like facilities does. So just wanted to take that minute to kind of re-ground us at how these two questions are a little bit different when it relates in financing and what these total dollar amounts look like, so that when you hear the feedback from Oriana, there's some kind of meat on the bones.
Okay. Can we pause here and just, if there's any questions about this piece before we go into the community feedback?
I feel like every time I see your presentation, I learn more, and I appreciate also the visual has, becoming more and more clear as you're presenting. One piece that I don't know what was my assumption before was the difference between the operating tax increase and the capital tax increase, and so from a home tax purpose, the capital one, just after 20 years, it gets readjusted. So in 20 years, that won't be an impact on people's home.
Correct. It would literally drop.
Yeah.
If we did nothing else.
Right. However, in operating, it gets incremental for 4 years. So people will see it incremental taxes for 4 years.
Yep.
And then when we reach that 4th year, that's how it's going to be, and then there's no additional increase for the next 20 years or the next 50 years.
If the board were to make no other actions, if nothing else were to happen, and if you were in that bubble, that nothing else happens, yes.
Thank you for,
no, it's good.
My question is, without the operating referendum, how many teachers and how many cuts would be needed to be made? Do we know that? Can we know that in advance?
Yeah, so we've talked about this back in the September operation work group. So our estimates kind of over the next 3 years cumulative is anywhere between $25 to $30 million of total reductions over the next 3 years, because the revenue continues to not meet kind of the expenditure rate. So the budget cuts would have to keep up with cost of living when the revenue limit itself doesn't. So, at $87,000 is our average teacher base, you could be looking at, kind of a 100 FTE impact over the 3 years.
Chris?
I just want to throw out there a different way of looking at this graph, particularly the operating referendum funding. If you look at the blue bars, which I think we can say reflect our projections of what will happen with the tax levy, correct?
Yep.
It's flat, and inflation is happening. So really what the green is showing us is unfortunately having to go back and ask the taxpayers to do what the state is not doing, which is provide us with levy authority to keep up with the cost of inflation. Is that a reasonable way of framing this?
I mean, it's one of the factors.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely one of the factors.
And yeah, I think that's good for now.
Yeah. I mean, health. I'll just throw in like healthcare. Right, costs are increasing wherever you are, far at the rate of inflation. Right, more like 5%. And so the costs of healthcare, by all means, are also embedded into our overall costs.
And is there anything else, healthcare, this state reduction in funding?
So the primary items that are causing the gap are related to kind of our base wage equaling inflation conversation. Primary kind of reason that we can't keep up, and healthcare being the other main item. Those are the primary gaps that are existing in our budget from a structural standpoint.
And I just thought of what else I was going to say. If the state authorized tax levy if they were to give us more revenue authority, we wouldn't have to take the green on top of it. That we would take what the state authorizes us, and we would not ask for an additional amount out of our taxpayers. This is just to kind of compensate for what the state is not allowing us to do.
I think Sabian.
So just to play that out, I
Yeah.
mean, this is a 10% increase by year 4. The operating referendum is a 10% increase by year 4. Is that track to inflation?
So inflation last year was 2.4%. So you accumulate that over 4 years. This year it's currently tracking at 1.8%.
Okay.
So it accumulates.
All right. Any other questions before we
Well,
get
I
into-
guess,
yeah.
I just, when we're talking about the base wage and the teacher salary, when we, state funding was reduced, right? We continued down this path of increasing wages for teachers and staff, right? And we just continued, right?
Right. That's again thanks to the kind of the local operating referendum. We had the ability
Right,
to do so.
to do so.
At different rates.
Right, right. And in order to continue, right, on this path, we are in this situation where we need to, right, to go back and ask for an operating referendum to keep up.
And do all the due diligence
because-
that we need to do,
Right.
right, around creating efficiencies in the system and continue to push on our cost reduction strategies. It's both and. Right? We can't just ask the public for kind of the reoccurring operating referendum. We need to also continue to push hard on what efficiencies we can gain throughout the system and continue to kind of do all of our due diligence around repurposing, just like we do every year.
And Kelly does have a much more thorough discussion
budget
planned for us around this in the budget piece of this discussion, which is after. We just wanted to kind of re-ground ourselves in the facts before we started seeing it.
In your layoff projection number, does that include not filling retired positions?
It does not include not filling retired positions.
Okay, all right.
So those that number would not automatically equal layoff.
Yeah.
Because we have retirees, and that we would likely be able to put staff into retired positions. That's just total FTE reduction.
Okay. And, I have read through Andrew's report, so, looking at this ask, especially for folks on fixed income, is big. If we were to look at paring it down, what year do you think is most flexible for that?
2021,
Mm-hmm.
the year of which we're creating the budget for now,
Yeah.
would be the year we would want to be looking at and talking now about the kind of efficiencies.
Okay.
If for no other reason, then that's the year that accumulates over 4 years. So we're doing the work now. I would argue to continue to look for efficiencies in 2021 while we're hearing the conversation.
Got it.
So this is a good setup for the next budget discussion, but why don't we dive into the research and then we'll circle back on the numbers.
Hi, I'm Oriana Eversole. I'm the Research and Program Evaluation Director. So I'm a little newer to MMSD. I started in July. So this is my first time presenting to the board or to the work group. And then I want to introduce Beth as well.
All right, I'm Beth Vade. I am the Interim Executive Director of Research Accountability and Data Use. I'm filling in for Andrew Stats.
You're all over the place.
So we just released our report for the Facilities and Operating Revenue Referenda Community Engagement and Input Report. And this covers all of the input sessions that we've been collecting information on, as well as the survey that we did, the community-wide survey. So we did present to you a proposed plan of how we would go about collecting community input. And in particular, we collected input from families, students, staff, and community members. So the other thing to consider as we're looking at this report and this input is that it's really not meant to represent your typical voter per se. That's more of the polling information. Ours is more of gauging the perspectives of people who are close to the work and will be most impacted by the work that we're proposing. And then as well as trying to get some, we also tried to get outreach to the broader community as well, but it wouldn't be a full representation of the voting community, if that makes sense. And so we looked at 4 primary areas that we're generating feedback on. So we took the facilities referendum and we looked at each of the 3 different main components of that. And so we looked at the 4 comprehensive high schools, the proposal for renovating those, acquiring and building a site and building a new elementary school in the Rimrock area, and then also the renovation of Hoyt School and relocating Capitol High to that site. So those 3 pieces we focused on as separate pieces and research questions. And then the possible operating referendum was another piece that we looked at, as well as just general input that we're hearing about the referenda, like both referendum put together. We really focused on having authentic, inclusive engagement. So we heard from all of you based on the when you did some visioning back with Andrew around what do you want this community input to look like? How will we know that we're hitting the mark with the referendum work, and how will we hear the voices of the community in that? So we really focused on that, reducing barriers for input sessions. We provided food, childcare, and transportation. We also provided interpretation, and wherever possible, we had small breakout sessions where the session was facilitated in their primary language, that they were most comfortable with. We also worked with Equity by Design, Annette Miller's company, and they supported the planning, facilitation, and designing of some of the sessions as well. So we worked in step with them for some of the sessions to raise the equity voice and certain demographic and geographic communities. So overall, all of the sessions that we've covered, we had 20 targeted input sessions. So those were the sessions that were very targeted on specific groups that might be most impacted by some of the work that we're proposing, or that will be a possibility with the referenda. We also focused on lifting up equity voices and minority voices. We also had informational sessions, so those were more general, where we gave people information about the referenda. So the referenda team also was involved in those, as well as dozens of other sessions that they engaged people with in addition. So these are more representative of what went into the research report. We also had 4 open community input sessions at each of the comprehensive high schools, reaching out and trying to get more of a community voice. And then that was a total of about 50 sessions with over 955 participants. The survey itself, we developed it in-house, but with consultation from the UW Survey Center. And we did an extensive email campaign as well as posting it to our website and promoting it through various venues. We had over 4,000 respondents and then 132 student respondents that we analyzed separately. And then again, the questions were focused on to what extent would you see that this particular item is a priority, and then how would you support that or at that particular cost or funding level. And then also included open-ended questions to allow for qualitative analysis. So all the qualitative analysis you see is a combination of the survey data and the input session data that we collected. So our findings, overall there's broad support for the possible referenda, so that's both referendum together. They did have a concern over the total cost when looking at both together. And then there were concerns over wanting to address inequity as a primary concern, especially when it was around the operating revenue, operating expenses. And they want us to continue to strive for more broad outreach. So when we look at focus community voices, we tried to pull out African American participants, and we had a African American focus group, as well as pulling out the qualitative data from African American survey respondents. They indicated that there was some support overall, but they wanted to focus on engagement and transparency, and they also wanted to have us address inequity and support Black excellence efforts. For Latinx participants, they wanted us to pursue greater equity for students as well, and they also highlighted other external pressures and concerns, such as the census and other things that they were concerned about that are immediate concerns for them over and above the referendum. Asian Hmong participants, they were supportive of reinvesting in the high schools. They also mentioned challenges about additional taxes and being for community members from low-income areas. Students raised 3 main points or concerns. They want us to prioritize sustainability and equal access. They had a question about why Malcolm Shabazz high school was not listed as one of the focus areas. And then they wanted continued focus efforts to engage students. And then if we pull out Equity by Design's highlights from their findings, they also mentioned that there was soft support overall, but there was fractured support by diverse stakeholders. They also mentioned that they were hearing from the community to have the board be involved and upfront and engaged with the diverse stakeholders. And they asked for more community engagement and to consider to invest in students and combat inequity. They also mentioned that people were very supportive of the fact that MMSD can be a pathway to broader social, equitable, and multicultural inclusion and solutions. So when we look at the survey findings, we see that when we look at the level of priority, and you'll see a little bit of a difference in level of priority versus support for funding. So more people tended to say, yes, this is a priority, but then when it came to funding, tended to be a little bit less supportive of putting their tax dollars or their dollars in that position. And I do want to say that primarily the people who answered the survey were primarily white homeowners who also were registered to vote. So when you think about the people who are taking the survey, we also had a high percentage of people who were MMSD parents or families and staff because of the way that the survey went out. Again, not representative of your typical voter per se. So they were overall supportive. The one that they were least supportive on was the Capitol High relocation, but the qualitative data suggested that they were just not as familiar about the programming at Capitol High or familiar with the topic. So that was one thing that weighed into that as well. Again, when we look at support of funding, so we just looked at prioritization, so now we're getting to support of funding. Capitol High relocation, interesting, kind of a converse of what I just said, but the Capitol High relocation, they actually had 70% support funding, so even though they weren't familiar with the programming, which made them think of it less of a priority, they actually supported the funding a little bit more. And then when we look at student survey responses, overall they had similar responses, but you'll see also for we did not ask students funding questions, so that's one thing that we did not present to them. We presented them for the priority questions. So we see similar trends, and we see less support of the Rimrock area school and Capitol High relocation. So in terms of the operating referendum, the survey responses provided that there was a majority support for the operating referendum, concern regarding the size of the operating referendum, and the desired transparency regarding what we would be using the funds for, and then target priorities that directly impact students. And then when we look at the operating referendum, for each of the different topic areas, we did look at it by relationship to MMSD, and we look at level of priority and support within these areas. So the first bars that you see, the first graph is level of priority, the second is support funding. So you'll see that there's a trend that we saw across the board, whether it was operating referendum or any parts of the capital referendum, were that if people had no selected relationship, for example, or a graduate or former parents, tended to have less support. So we saw this general theme of people who were less connected directly to the district primarily, were less supportive of some of the referendum items. We also saw that age was a factor, so those people who were over 55 were less likely to support the referendum in the priority areas. And then also in terms of supporting funding, we saw less support in those areas as well. And then again, qualitative themes for high school reinvestment. We saw strong support for reinvesting in the high schools. They mentioned a needs-based fashion, but they didn't say exactly what that would be. Would that be more students? Would it be based on equity in terms of minority support? And then they also mentioned a focus on consider issues of equity and to have a focus on sustainability, maintenance, and preventative maintenance. The new Rimrock area school, there was strong support that we should build a school in the Rimrock area. There was not a clear consensus. However, there was more participants spoke favorably of the choice to have Frank Alice attendance area students attend the new school. So there were some factors with that, which was, and we'll go into kind of the New Estramundo and then Frank Alice feedback, which is on the next slide. But some factors in that were that the New Estramundo families wanted to have room to grow, and the fact that the new school might be capped at about 450 students was a concern for them. And then the Rimrock area families expressed a desire to continue working closely with the community to identify options for the school. So here it breaks it down for Frank Alice staff and families and then New Estramundo community school staff and families. Considering these are two major stakeholder groups that would be impacted by having a new school or potential move. So again, Frank Alice staff and families, they were supportive of the school. It would limit long bus rides. They did have a concern about families that are close to Alice having to then be the ones taking bus rides over to the Rimrock area. And then for New Estramundo, they indicated that a neighborhood school might better serve Rimrock students overall, and they expressed support for a larger permanent space, even potentially getting a K-8, like expanding their programming to different grade levels. And then relocating Capitol High, there's overall support for relocating Capitol High to Hoyt, concern regarding logistical challenges such as transportation, concern regarding the future programming for MSCR. This is particularly among older people over the age of 55. And then at the input sessions, the Capitol High staff and families, to raise those voices as well, they were supportive of the opportunity to create a more cohesive campus and expanded programming. And they were just concerned that if they did move, that they didn't want to grow so fast that then it would impact their programming or the small class size and intimate culture that they have. Then I'll turn it back over.
So I'm going to wrap it up real quick, and then we're going to open it up. So the board completed a poll towards the end of 2019, and our survey that Oriana just kind of walked you through gives us one bar, and it tends to be a bar of those who know us the best. because they're our most immediate outreach and more likely to answer our survey. So the reason for doing a poll is to get to the actual voting population and to try to get a kind of a base of where you're at with your current proposal, using who's kind of most likely to vote. So the good news is, based on the poll, the trends that we're seeing coming out of our input sessions in particular are really in line. And what we're seeing, is that the facilities kind of plan as laid out is gathering some pretty decent, support. And then the operating is gaining support, but not at the same levels as the facilities, right? So the polling and then everything that Oriana kind of just walked you through is really in line, and the overall themes and main takeaways that we got out of the poll and that we got out of the overall survey. So I'm just leave it at that because I know we've kind of gone long, and we'll open it up.
Yeah, we can dive into questions. Vicki.
Yes, noticed that Native American groups, individuals with disabilities, and other minority groups weren't listed among the stakeholders because of the low number of participation, or were they not asked?
So we met specifically with the special education parent group, and so they are included in the targeted input sessions. And you are correct, we did not specifically meet with kind of the Native American parent group for this particular effort. But as through the course of all the information sessions, of course, everyone was invited.
So I've got 3 questions, I think. And the first one is related to some things I heard from students at the sessions I attended. And it seems like the students are very excited about sustainability and green building being built into our building referendum. And I wondered if you could comment about where we're headed with that.
So I've mentioned this a few times. At this point, these project recommendations are really a master planning exercise with schematic drawings and some initial budgets set aside for the work aligned, if we take the high schools, towards $70 million in improvements and renovations. Every piece of those improvements and those renovations would certainly have an eye on energy efficiency and return on investment for the money that the taxpayers are investing in these projects. At this point, we do have a budget set aside. I think it's at $150,000 at each site for a solar array that would end up going on some new roof membrane. A solar investment of that size would be a drop in the bucket in terms of the actual offset that would happen with the actual energy our big high schools use. The real return on investment on all of these projects will be things like new windows, new roof membranes with updated insulation, new exterior doors, and new highly efficient heating and cooling systems. We would have the option, if we wanted to consider it, to actually set aside money out of these projects for sustainability projects by themselves. And those would be things like a much bigger solar array that could go on these high schools, potentially adding to some of the heating and cooling projects. So we could maybe consider something like a geothermal system or something, a hybrid system to be more efficient. So I don't know if that answered your question specifically. Certainly you have my word that as we build them and design them, we'll have an eye on efficiency. As with any project that you're trying to embed efficiency standards into, they can become more costly. So there's a cost-benefit analysis that if you want to do a decked-out geothermal system, and we have budgeted, let's say, $6 million at Memorial High School, that may be a $12 or $13 million project. We either have to add to the scope of the project or take away from other aspects of the project to pay for it.
That's helpful, and I think as we move forward with our communications planning, I think it's really important to embed what we are able to do with the current budget in terms of green building and energy efficiency, because many people in our community, not just students, are very passionate about making sure that we do as much as we can to lower our carbon footprint of our schools.
We heard it loud and clear. I agree.
My second question is actually about the Rimrock plan. And that is, I'm wondering, Oregon is building a new school in that area, right on the edge of MMSD. And I was wondering if you could speak to what you know about that school, how many MMSD kids it could absorb through open enrollment, and what our strategy is to try to keep kids in MMSD.
Yeah, I know a little bit about that. To Chris's point, Oregon is building a school on the far north side of their attendance area in Fitchburg. As the crow flies, would be probably less than a mile. It is less than a mile. Then that South Rimrock Road attendance area that we're actually targeting. They are, the school's being constructed right now. It's 130,000 square feet. To give you all perspective on the size of, that's a school the size of Hamilton and Van Nuys combined. So it is a big elementary school. And will be a very nice, shiny new school just on our border. So that is certainly something to consider. I think there are certainly possibilities of that being an attractive place for students who live in close proximity to potentially open enrollment to. No mystery to us when that happens.
So as it relates to the overall open enrollment strategy, I mean, that is, this work goes back 2 years, but kind of as a reminder, this is one of the reasons why this community was looked at in particular through our long-range planning. The open enrollment plan is if the community knows a school is being built in their neighborhood, they are likely to stay, and if we can get that school built quick, enroll in the school. If they don't know or think a school is being opened in their neighborhood and we continue to put them on a 45-minute bus ride, we vastly increase the likelihood that they open and roll out of the district. And what we know is once we lose someone in kindergarten, first or second, we rarely ever get them back. And so it's a 12, 15, 20-year open enrollment strategy, because once you lose them for 1 year, you've probably lost them for 12. And so maintaining the neighborhood in the district and providing strong, good supports for families is by far and away one of the most proactive open enrollment strategies you can take.
Can I just ask a question to follow up on that? Does Oregon have students to fill that school as big as it is? I mean, do they have?
Yeah, so there's a major development happening right now, actually in very close proximity, essentially the same neighborhood.
Yeah.
That's being improved right now. That they have the projections to essentially justify the school. So they will not open that school day one full of Oregon residents. There will be room to accept open enrollees, which has not necessarily been the case for Oregon in the past in terms of their elementary schools. But they've recently expanded their high school, and this additional elementary school will give their district some additional capacity as well. Yeah, it will not open full.
Okay.
And then my third question is actually more of a comment, but if people have input on it, it'd be great if I could get feedback. And that is, there was polling data. This is the poll of just the general voters, not the survey of MMSD families. But if you dig into that, I thought it was interesting that it showed that when you told people more about the operating referendum, their likelihood to vote for it increased. And when you told people more about the building referendum, their likelihood to vote for it actually decreased a little bit. And after informing people, the two are pretty much balanced. They actually looked pretty similar in terms of, support or lack thereof. And I'm kind of wondering why we saw the decrease with the building referendum, as well as just a general comment that, I think that speaks to how important our communications plan is going to be, and I think we need to get really strategic about how we talk to people, especially about the operating referendum, to try to bump up that support a little bit.
Yeah, Kate might.
Yeah, and maybe I'll comment a little bit on, because I thought some of the interesting trends there. I mean, my own interpretation of the difference between operating and facilities referendum was twofold. One was when we ran the poll of the community, the facilities referendum has been something we've talked about for a really long time. It's been in the papers, it's been something that we've had numerous public meetings on, and that, to your point on communication, that we've just kind of had a much more robust and thorough ability to talk with people. And then the second is something that I think, Kelly, you mentioned, which is facilities is really easy to get your head around. And we're making a step change investment in our high schools, right? This is the type of investment we haven't made in a generation. It's the type of investment the city, I think, needs and wants, and is maybe just a little bit easier to understand the rationale to keep Madison competitive. So that was my own interpretation of kind of, we haven't done that same job on the operating referendum, and it's talking about kind of the regular operating budget is not quite as sexy as.
Yeah, just a little caution in reading that. We tested out talking points for both facilities and operating. So depending on which kind of talking points, both in facilities and operating, some things like polled a little better than others, because we tested out like different messaging strategies. So there isn't any, it just helps you decide what messaging strategy, to your point on the communication plan.
I think we shared just a little bit from the poll, and the big takeaway from my perspective there was, and really the intention was to pair it with the work that this team did, so that we had a sense of, does our school community want the same thing as our voting community, and do we have voter support as well to support kind of the school investments, was that there really is broad support from both the school communities as well as the voting community in the city for facilities in particular, and for operating as they kind of learn more. So
I think Anika.
There is awesome. So I have a question, and then I have some comments from Student Senate about the plan. So my question was about the survey, actually. So about the 132 student respondents. To put that in perspective for me, I guess that's like about a fifth at my grade at Memorial right now. So I was just wondering in like what ways you went about to communicate it to the students.
So we primarily sent it through email, and we typically do see a low response rate for students, so I can look into other ways that we could have promoted it or promote other ways of reaching out to students. We also met with Student Senate, and then the Student Advisory Council was part of one of our input sessions. So we reached out to students in multiple ways, but they do typically have a relatively low response rate when they're with an email campaign. But
yeah, for sure. So I know based on my own experience, for the EOS survey, we have like time allocated in class to actually take the survey, which in general helps us with response rates. So I was just wondering, like in the future, if that would be an option you guys could consider.
I think it depends on the type of feedback we're looking for, and then how we position it. So yeah,
that's what we do with like the climate survey.
Cool. So Student Senate also had a statement prepared for this meeting. So over the course of the past few months, Student Senate has been reviewing the district's facilities plan for the referendum in 2020. Through a process of carefully reading the facilities assessments, meeting with members of the administration, and interacting with our peers, Student Senate has gained a sense of its impacts on students. Considering the scale and importance of these potential impacts, we have the following recommendations, which is first that MMSD should develop a school-specific student-only facility survey rather than sending out like a general one, which you guys did, which could help like improve the responses based on the conditions at different schools. And next, that MMSD should create facility focus groups at all high schools during school hours and market these opportunities more to the entire school body. And looking forward, we hope to present more detailed advice from our own behalf of the facilities plan to the board in the upcoming spring when specific aspects of the plan come under consideration.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we don't forget that Chad did a very extensive amount of work in all of our high schools leading up to the work, where it was entirely student and staff focused. So I just want to make sure we don't forget about the work that happened before this ever started.
And just this, Annika, I'd be thrilled to speak to Student Senate on that if you guys have any questions on that, because I think it happens to be a good point on how things get disseminated. After all, it is your schools. I think that's definitely of interest. So anytime, I'll shoot you a text.
And there was a high school report that's linked in this report that shows the extensive work that happened last year as well. And that's why we were building off of 5 years of community input and the student input. So that's another reason why we didn't go as extensive on the high schools at this point. But I think thinking about whatever next phase we need to do, then we can consider the suggestions. So thank you.
I just wanted to say that I really appreciate your voice every time you speak to us and hold us accountable. The other thing that came to mind is how we are now leveraging the high school students that are going to be voting. So, that's not, we talk about voters and we talk about students as like they're mutually exclusive, and there's like a large number of students that are going to be voting for the first time, this year. So I think it's really important to treat them like as efficient and with such importance as we are when we talk about voters in general. So I really appreciate that.
I have a couple of questions or comments. The first, I want to go back to Chris, your comment on sustainability. I guess a question for the board, which is, you said we have $150,000 for each high school right now budgeted. Open question if we wanted to increase that, and I'm not sure we want to go to the geothermal level, but if we, in a referendum of this size, it's very small, it would be a very small impact to add a little bit and make a bigger impact around sustainability. So just a question for the board, if that was guidance we wanted to give.
May I ask, does that take away, would we still have be able to afford air conditioning if we did that?
Chad answer, but I think yes.
We would. I guess, if I'm hearing Chris correctly, or if I'm hearing Kate correctly, I think we have the possibility of almost like a standalone sustainability package that could be embedded into this. That may not even have to, if we wanted to give examples of projects, may not even have to be actually aligned to the facilities we're investing in. We just put a brand new roof on Lowell Elementary School. And there's been some interest from some of the folks in that neighborhood about the feasibility of a solar project at Lowell. So I think as a district, we're interested in reducing our carbon footprint. We've certainly heard from many folks at these community input sessions that sustainability is an important part of these projects. So if I'm hearing, do you want us to maybe take a run at
I would be very supportive of increasing the amount to a couple of $1 million. And from my perspective, I think there's sustainability impact as an outcome, but also some sustainability education and the opportunity for students, particularly if it's coming for students, to lead and drive some of how that investment is made by understanding the impact, by doing the life cycle analysis, by doing the kind of research and collaboration even with our there's something there that we could create and construct that might be a joint venture almost between students and schools, fueled by this funding to drive sustainability.
Yeah, so I mean, Kate, to your point, I think there's the possibility of a small tax impact, even if we said a kind of $1 million stipend at each site that we know these are sustainability specific projects that we could use this, potentially have the students help us plan them along, and there are also ways to have some of the analytics that come along after the projects are actually on the site that could be used for learning. It'd be great.
I think there are in regards to the sustainability conversation, there are your visible projects that everybody talks about, like, solar panel. There's lots of pros and cons around the solar panels that it takes into consideration in regards to your return to investment, for example. But it is the sexy thing to talk about. I think the other thing that I would be interested in exploring, and I'm not trying to create another pet project for you, Chad, but kind of am, is in regards to food. Food is the accessibility to food and the how food gets distributed and the food waste, the food transportation to the high schools, all of that impact carbon footprint. Is there something around any creative projects around farm to school programs and more sustainable ways to provide lunch at the school level, and or other creative outside of the sort of the light bulb and the waste kind of disposable things that we can start exploring. And I would love if the student senate, would like to push some of those things also forward in regards to, creative projects. I love the idea also around the school specific, because I think honoring like your own capacity to do your own campaign among your peers, I think is also important for, both the sustainability of whatever it is that we are trying to create, but also from an educational perspective too, having that support of the community.
Yeah, great point, Ananda. There becomes a tipping point with some of these projects in terms of how much time and money you want to invest into the actual planning and designing of the projects before we send them to ballot. So right now we've got money set aside on each of these projects for site improvements. That could include a school garden, certainly. Could include potentially outside, who knows, a greenhouse. We've got money set aside for redoing spaces like culinary labs. And we have a full year set on kind of the post-referendum schedule to be working in the schools around the programming needs on how these projects come to life, which student involvement will be key on. Are you looking for something back to you, or just for us to take that into consideration as we plan forward around that piece?
I was mostly responding to Kate's question
sustainability
around.
idea, and you're taking a different.
No, I was doing the level of investment, right? Like I feel like for me, it's like one thing to say, yeah, let's raise another 50,000, another 100,000. I feel less motivated for that than to say like, here are some of the creative things that the schools or the students are voicing. That they would like to engage or they like to see in their schools, whether it's a rain garden, whether it's whether there's some partnership with the city. That's the other thing that I haven't heard much is like how we're partnering with the city and other business around public gardens or whatever it is, right? Or sustainable roofs or whatever. So that's, to me, that was what I'm kind of leaning in is to, I don't feel like we needed to have like a full comprehensive proposal, but I think there is I feel like we have asked that question. I think there is an interest, and it'd be good to have as a metrics, right? Like here's how much we can increase or can decrease the carbon footprint by doing XYZ things, aside from the things that are sometimes debatable because of the cost intensive to, like, for example, the solar panel. So that's what I was responding to, was to a comment around the level of investment. I'm trying to figure out, like, instead of investing more on more solar panels, can we invest on other creative projects that are driven by students and schools that are more expensive in their nature, and perhaps more the collaboration with other partners or the city or the county or the Farm Alliance or other nonprofits.
Chris, then Gloria.
So I want to echo what Ananda said. I really believe in green investment. I want to make sure that like what we're investing in is going to have the most impact in terms of our carbon footprint. So, getting some kind of analysis of like if we put solar panels on our buildings, what are we going to get in return in terms of cutting back on our carbon emissions versus other possible strategies like buying more green energy. I also want to just get a little bit into the weeds of the budget for the building referendum.
Can you stay on the sustainability?
Yes,
Because
totally.
I actually have others as well. It's just my.
I guess I just, I thought that we had already, I'm sorry.
It is my turn, right?
I thought that was already included in sort of, that included in the facilities plan.
There
with
is a
sustainability.
There is a sustainability section in the
Yeah.
plan where we did outline
Right.
kind of a square foot analysis on the return on investment you typically
Right,
see when you turn over buildings that are reaching their end of useful life. So that does exist, to Gloria's point. We haven't done any type of detailed analysis on like an additional investment in solar. So we could maybe add to that portion of the plan, but Gloria is correct.
Okay.
My question actually was more to Ananda's point, which I think is a good one. But several of our schools have community gardens and have done some quite good work with Muir, Badger Rock. I really like the one with the outdoor classroom, and I'm trying to remember if Spring Harbor. And La Follette was also very nice. I think we could use some of what we have to increase that. And I was talking when I was at the West Raimondo with the food service person who helps run the food service for the district. And she said she would be very interested in at least hearing about some of these ideas. So I figure, why don't we look there first?
Okay, so to close the sustainability discussion, can I try to summarize an action for you guys? Maybe what we're looking for is your guidance on if there are other high impact avenues that we could make investments in collaboration with potentially some of the community partners, city, and students. Then we'd be potentially willing to increase the funding currently allocated, but we want to make sure that it's high ROI.
Correct.
Not necessarily the shiny thing on the top of the building. Is that a fair summary of this discussion? And we'd like to just get that information back before voting, and then we can. I'm not seeing nods to that summary.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
Okay.
I would just add to that in addition to, before we add to the top of the referendum, I'd actually like to look and see if there's anything we can repurpose within the ask before we add it to it. So.
Yeah, that's what I would suggest too.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Okay. I had two other comments, and then Chris, I'll move to you. Was there any specific feedback from really any of the stakeholders you spoke to on the plans themselves that we've made? So we have quite specific kind of architectural drawings and ideas, particularly around the high schools, but was there any specific feedback on those plans that is of note, I guess, that surprised us or that?
Yeah, I think to Oriana's point, broad support. We certainly heard interesting ideas out there, but it was kind of anywhere from, at East High School, we'd like to see a detailed plan on bike traffic. The person there was very interested in biking and as with a sustainability lens, all the way to, I heard from a few folks, knock down East High School and build a new one, and kind of everywhere in between. I can't speak to any other than just,
Let me try.
Excitement more than anything.
We know the West community cares about the Ash Street entrance, and as it relates to the design and construction of West,
and the pool.
It's really important to them that the West Street, Ash Street entrance is kind of protected. So like heavy on our radar, a clear theme. We met with the students and families at Capitol High. The students, just like any of the other students, they have a lot of investment and input on the specifics of what they would like, potentially their future school. We did not have a weight room in that plan.
It's true.
Clearly, they said, can you find a corner of the building? We can get the equipment itself donated, but we would love a weight room. So we've definitely heard specifics like that, but nothing that changes the plans by millions of dollars, right? This is more the kind of feedback we need post November 2020, to be honest. Yeah.
And then last question from me, and I'm trying mostly to come up with the things we would want before we vote, marching towards a March vote on this. Going back to the RIMRAC discussion, is it possible for the team to put together some math with the mapping to the comment on the Oregon School, and then we also have One City expansion, and I'd just be curious the total number of students in that area and the total number of seats available between the potential 3 schools, the Oregon School, One City, and then our potential school. I'd love to see how much space is being created, and if we build a new school, if it is if the space is needed.
Yeah, I think in both cases, but particularly in Oregon, the idea is that our students don't leave for Oregon. So the goal is to stay here. So I don't quite know how the Oregon example plays
Yeah,
out.
I think I appreciate the intention that we will compete and win with 2 other schools, but we'll be the last school built also. And so I just want to.
Yeah, these are our
The
kids,
math
though.
may be really obvious. It may be that there's plenty of
Sure.
students in that area, and I'm not
Sure,
aware
I'll
of
add into the calculation how much
facilities.
investment we would lose
But I just love
if
to
we
see-
lost the
to make
kids.
sure there's enough students to fill up 3 buildings or
yeah.
close to it.
I mean, Kelly, I think you just hit right on it. I'd say that's what I would want to know, right? Is the implication of this for us and how many students and the loss of students leaving our district potentially is very important. I think we have to keep our students in our schools, yeah. I mean, I think that those are the numbers that I would be interested in.
Chris.
So I just have a clarification question on the budget, which is getting a little bit into the weeds. But if you look at the capital improvement budget, most of the things in this budget are things like classroom upgrades or HVAC. And then you get to Pathways Innovation, and it's $1 million per school, and it's not clear what that money is being used for. And I think as we move forward, we've got to be completely transparent with people who will be voting for this about what that means. Like, what are we buying with Pathways Innovation money? Because if it just comes across as we're padding the budget, it's not going to be good.
Yeah, that's certainly to your point around communication. At this point, that is a kind of a square foot budget placeholder. We've got areas for pathways set aside in each of these projects. Lab spaces are typically cost at least twice as much to renovate compared to stock classroom spaces. We made the decision to put a placeholder on pathways with the idea that even as we're building these things and designing them, the spaces would be built around the needs of the students and the staff at the time we're programming them.
I would highly recommend taking that out and putting the money into classrooms, labs, things that are more concrete to voters, and which it probably would be spent on anyway.
Just pull the pathways language?
I would pull the Pathways Innovation language and put that $1 million into where we would actually spend it, whether it's in furniture or classrooms or laboratories.
Describe what.
If it's into collaborative learning space, actually
Yeah.
put that money into where it would actually be spent on.
I think
We know
might-
that the budget's going to end up moving a little bit anyway. So.
Yeah, it'll move quite a bit.
That might actually work.
Okay, noted.
I think Ali also had a. So, I just wanted to ground and I'm trying to understand the conversation around Ring Rock, because the way I see is that although the districts around us have acted much more proactively and build buildings and structures around our district to both maintain their students, because Madison have actually attracted a lot of students from outside of the district, and also to potentially attract us, and to also invest in their community. I mean, I think that's why people, I think that's why communities, municipalities, and cities invest in larger schools, is because they're investing in their community. They know if they build, that people are going to come and there'll be more resources. The sad part is that we haven't done that necessarily, although I do think that there is a great opportunity here, and I have an opportunity to travel around the state, and people do speak really highly about our programs. They do speak highly about our dual language immersion program. They do speak highly about our inclusive efforts with students with IEPs. They do speak highly about our innovations around pathways. So I know we are in such echo chambers that we wanted to improve, that we think about like just improving, and we don't see that like there are a lot of benefits to attend Madison schools, and we don't spend a lot of time as a governing body talking about the benefits, right? And now the conversation around Oregon, it made me feel like a little confused. Are we saying that we are questioning whether or not we're building this building because we're gonna
we may not be able to retain the students, instead of having a conversation about like, how do we make this building be amazing so we don't lose any students? And in fact, I'm sorry, Oregon, I love you a lot, but we're gonna get some of your students because we're close to you and we're gonna have an amazing program that no other school district in Dane County is doing. That's what I want to spend, energy and time in doing, and sharing with our staff that is what we should be spending our time in, not based on fear and based on like, should we do this and how we're gonna. Instead of say like, how do we create a really fantastic school with a really innovative program with, different things in that building that both students and families are not going to be able to turn away from.
My turn?
Yeah, then I'll.
Okay. Thank you, Ananda, for that, bringing us to that. I think that's appreciated. My question was around Nuestro Mundo. And I don't know, do you guys want to touch that? Your looks were like, I'm just wondering what, I know we've heard from students and staff over at Nuestro Mundo, and wondering if we've talked to board members, and what is it that you're specifically hearing as far as, I know from what I hear is that they want, obviously, a building of their own, right, and they want growth, right? Does it matter where, and at what location? Did you hear any sort of feedback on where they would want Nuestro Mundo built?
There were interesting conversations. I think there's a tendency to want like a shiny new school, right? But then there's also in the rooms, and especially I was in a focus group, a breakout session with primarily Spanish-speaking parents. They just are so proud of the school. So the sentiment is that they're so proud of the school and they want to grow, and they're saying we need to grow into different grade levels and we need to have space and just room to expand. So that was the big thing that I was hearing in my session and then throughout a lot of our feedback. So I just thought that was interesting. So I would say that really expresses where a majority of them, that their mindsets were from the feedback that we were hearing. Do you have anything to add to that, Kelly?
Yeah, the only other thing, I agreed with Oriana. The only other thing that came up a few different times in the kind of the English session that I was in with Nuestro Mundo was how important it is to kind of maintain that the foundation that's been developed at Nuestro Mundo. I don't think there's any interest from their community in going back to a kind of a dual use site. That popped up a couple times and people kind of squashed that quickly. There were a couple folks that said it would be amazing just to have their own charter school that the district owns, and it didn't matter where it was.
That's exactly the feedback.
The deep roots and the foundation of that community that school was built was the thing that was most important. It wasn't the brick and mortar.
Okay. I attended one of the sessions out there, and that's what I heard, was that it really doesn't matter where, they just really wanted their own building, and a building that was owned by
It has to be their own. That's
Yeah,
the most important.
their own, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you all very much for presenting to us and continuing to give us greater and greater access to information and more expansive information. I think, when I look at kind of thematically across the 4 high schools, which is where the large majority of funding is going, that there are these kind of salient areas of just infrastructure investment that have needed the attention of the district for a really long time. And so I think those are not the areas that we spend a ton of time talking about, but very consistently we've heard things like renovations to bathrooms as a sincere necessity, right? Like sincere biological reality of what it means to have thousands of young people needing to access space to go to the bathroom, right? And so
lock the door.
So some of the things we're talking about, I I think, you know, we can get kind of away from some of the large scale infrastructure investment that is necessitated. And I think it would be really helpful to have kind of an emphasis around how long it's been since we've kind of invested in those areas of infrastructure, and what happens if we don't. Because I think the question, can we afford this, is one really relevant question, and we're asking that of our entire community. I think the other question is, can we afford not to do this? And I think that gets at a little bit of what folks have been talking about in terms of, you know, how we maintain our enrollment, how we continue to be a competitive district. But I think that we've reached a level of expense based in kind of a prolonged lack of ability to address some very serious elements of our school's infrastructure. And so any way to kind of drive home that point, I think, is relevant and useful. And I also greatly appreciate our community's support of our schools and a continued commitment to investing in our schools. And I greatly appreciate that you were able to get that feedback. And I think, you know, looking at what allows for us to maintain that support, if we're seeing folks are saying, hey, for the most part, we're supportive, how do we keep folks invested and supportive, and also how do we get folks who maybe haven't made up their minds yet? What are kind of the points of compelling folks to get behind this effort with us?
I have one very, very quick. This will be probably at a different discussion, but I'm putting it in there now. And that would be this. How are we on the update, updating the seclusion and restraint rooms, and do we need to do so?
Well, that one's a little bit outside my area of expertise. I think I would put that, kind of in the category of programming. If a referendum were to pass with a given budget, we would spend a full year working with the staff and students and community to design these buildings. That would be a decision that would have to be made on the programming side. If those are rooms that would be updated in our high schools. If we found there was a need on the staff side, we built into the budget and the plan.
There was, thank you, Laura, for saying the thing about Nostromondo and how people just want a school. I was there at some point, with my daughter, where we just wanted a school. And it didn't matter where it was. And I just feel so humbled by being part of a community that asks often so little. And I really hope that, that we do justice to the Spanish-speaking population that has to be part of the school in order to program exist, and where they live in order for us to allocate that school in a way that's beyond equitable is the justice thing to do.
Okay, are there any other questions in the spirit of the question you asked us on Saturday? Is there anything else we need to know or hear from you before voting in March on these? And we have a budget discussion next, which is quite significant, so which will be more relevant for the operating referendum, but really on facilities. Is there anything else? Now is the time to share, and I would like to close this section after that.
Can I take a quick crack at making sure that I've got this right?
Please, Chad, yeah.
So we have, to Gloria's point, already in a sustainability section. We're going to add to that with potentially maybe some project proposals or some added language in the plan so voters are clear on what's going on with sustainability. To Chris's point, we can kind of redact a version to pull out pathway-specific language in terms of what we have built into those master plans. And I think a lot of the other stuff has to do with communication in terms of what happens if we don't do these projects and so forth. And some of that may just happen after the vote. Am I missing anything on the facility side that you guys need to see? A lot of the other stuff will have to do with operating.
He's gonna share back some information with this group. Yep.
And we have some
Thank you.
back and forth over the next couple
Incredibly
months.
well informed on this, and I certainly feel ready to vote. So.
All right.
It's been
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Very, very positive. Thank you, Beth and Ariana. Okay, save the best for last.
I appreciate the latitude. I appreciate the latitude. Thank you.
We appreciate that. When you start having kids and you have a kid.
Oh my god. You guys, I've been asleep by this time the last 3 nights, seriously.
Oh, thank you, just for just eating. Okay.
Okay, folks, let's keep moving. We've got more meetings after this, so I know it's gonna be a long week. All right. So Kelly, do you want us to pause anywhere in here, or do you want to run through it and then?
I have one pause.
Okay.
After the goals kind of section. Does that work for you, Kate?
Yep.
All right. All right, we're getting started?
You can handle it.
All right. We are in January. We are continuing the discussion on the 2021 budget. We started this conversation in November. And in November, we got a good amount of feedback from you guys that helped us do a lot of work over the course of December on kind of getting the budget ready and really honing in our assumptions to get to what we have in front of you today. So kind of our goals for today are to ground ourselves in the entire budget process, really, in the equity vision of this board and of the school district. And there's 2 key tools that really help us do that the board both voted on and passed. And those 2 tools are the educational equity policy itself, which was completely rewritten and revised just a few years ago, and have kind of specifics for us on how we do our budgeting process through the lens of equity. And then, of course, our strategic framework. That was written by over 2,000 people in the community and very clearly lay forward the goals, values of our school district through our equity vision. So I'm going to ground us in that before we move forward to make sure everyone is really in alignment, because they are what then creates the specific budgeting goals and guiding principles that me and my team and our budget team, which of course includes Lisa and Deirdre on the HR side, to get to the assumption. So by the time we end this time together, I need you understanding the assumptions that are in the budget, because we get into detailed work over the next couple of months to get towards our April budget based on the assumptions that are in front of you tonight. So you all know our strategic framework vision that every school will be a thriving school that prepares every student to graduate from high school, college, career, and community ready. And it is in that vision that we build our budget. And every budget decision we make should be and will be through the lens of our core values that we hold true. Dr. Rose just so eloquently put belonging into the room earlier today. And of course, we lead with belonging. But excellence, creativity, racial equity, social justice, voice, and focus are those core values that these decisions should really be kind of tested against. And then, of course, every decision that we make through the budgeting process is meant to be towards the goal of moving our academic outcomes kind of forward, laid out in the 3 goals that are in the strategic framework. That every child will graduate ready for college, career, and community, that our schools will thrive, and specifically on goal 3, that African American children and youth will excel in school. So if we put those things forward and use our educational equity policy as the parameters through which we work that clearly call out kind of the allocation of resources process as we make decisions, right? So the educational equity tool is a tool that just in the last kind of year and a half, we started to create and test out. The educational equity tool is a tool meant to implement the educational equity policy itself. So the equity tool has come up in a number of these budgeting conversations, and I just want to make sure we all really can grasp what the equity tool is. The equity tool is a tool designed for individual policy and decision making. It's a set of questions that should be asked when making key decisions, whether it's through the budget or any other policy. If we're making a singular decision, we ask ourselves these questions, forcing us to pause, forcing us to think about our stakeholders, forcing us to think about who is most affected by the decision of which we're about to make. The idea is that then asking yourself those questions and answering them very deliberately will embed an equitable-based decision into your decision making. Now, the budget process itself is a series of hundreds of individual decisions all combined together into what we call the budgeting book. So we can't, in my personal opinion, walk the budget through the equity tool as the budget is a singular thing and the equity tool as a singular thing. I don't actually think it's physically possible. My proposal to you is that we think about using the equity tool through the budgeting process through like a time series of the board taking on impactful decisions as it relates primarily to the policies of how we invest our funding. So I'm hoping that makes sense, but here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking about 53% of our operating budget is spent through the class size policy. It largely determines where our teacher allocation and resources are spent. Evaluating the class size policy is not going to be a short task for the board, but it might be something that you pick up in the summer or the fall for evaluation through next year that maybe is implemented in the 21, 22 year or after, up to the board, but something to think about as you're building your calendar for the summer and into next year. Very similarly, the employee handbook is a very large document, which is also embedded in hundreds of individual decisions. The employee handbook itself drives not only like how we fund staff salaries, that's something that we talk about, but additive pay, extended employment pay, contract pay, how many periods you teach, how many hours a day you work, are all embedded into the employee handbook. Every one of those things, and hundreds more, are tied to resources. And if there was a kind of deliberate attempt to go through the employee handbook and take on some of the higher leverage strategies that the board might want to look at, that would be work that goes through the handbook committee. The handbook committee meets over the summer. The board helps set those agendas. And then typically in December or January, the results of the handbook committee come back to the board for voting. And then when the board votes, it goes into the following kind of school year. So there's a year lag to that work. So my recommendation is that you think through some of those bigger rocks as far as how the equity tool and the budgeting process looks to get them kind of the most resources identified of how you may want to look at reallocation. But for the short term, what I'm suggesting is that me and my team, and Lisa and I have already kind of started this very interesting work, which is to go back to the 14-15 school year and identify all the priority projects and strategic equity projects that have been invested that are still in the budget today. Because they, somewhere between 14-15 and today, right, they hit an investment category of the board that the board would have approved. And a number of them are still in the budget today because they're reoccurring strategies. Anything from behavior and health in schools is in there, to investing in more psychologists and counselors, till our resources around the behavior education plan and more are all in kind of that grouping. I'm suggesting that we analyze it. It's about $17 million. That we analyze it and we ask ourselves the equity tool questions today. What did we plan to accomplish with the investment that we made? What outcomes did we get? Who was it set to serve? Did it serve those who we intended it to serve? And if not, where we are today, kind of doing that discussion through our senior leadership team, Jane, and eventually coming to you back in the March and April timeframe. If not, does that mean we should stop something? Does that mean we should change and repurpose something? Or does that mean that's something we should invest more in because it's working, we're getting the outcomes we're looking for, and that means something more for our strategic equity projects moving forward, potentially for new or expansion? So with that in mind, I built the draft budget goals and the draft budget principles moving forward, and then I'm going to pause. So the budget goals that I've drafted, looking for any edits or comments from you tonight. Distribute equitable resources to support those with highest needs. As we look at the class size policy and allocation, a specific eye towards reducing the number of sections below minimum, which thus allows us to target our resource allocation towards those who need it the most. Using that educational equity tools I just suggested through the strategic equity project kind of lens. And then as we look forward to any new investments, maintaining a focus of the set of highest priority needs for this year. And then providing total compensation steps plus base wage equal to or greater than the estimated cost of living. I'll get to that slide in just a minute. I think there's a way to get to slightly more than kind of step plus base wage equaling cost of living. But as setting a goal that we get these things done. The guiding principles then are more parameters of how we work. So the goals are the goal to get to, principles are our parameters with which we work within. So we build 2 budgets this year. One that sets forward a passing operating budget, one that sets forward a potential non-passing referendum budget. As mentioned, we allocate resources in line with getting the most investment and outcomes for our strategic framework goals. We need to maintain a multi-year strategy, particularly as we look forward. We talked earlier about our 3-year kind of horizon outlook for our revenue. And while we're trying to balance this budget, particularly on the non-passing version of the budget, doing everything we can to maintain stabilities in schools and stability in programs for this year, thereby maximizing the most efficiencies we can find at central office and other student programming. We don't want to Ananda's point earlier, kind of fear people into passing the budget. We need to do everything we can this year with maximizing efficiencies where we can find them. And then on the priority projects, building on previous practice that shows promise. So I'm going to pause there before I kind of get into the nitty-gritty of the budget to make sure we're all on the same page with the working parameters of where we're going moving forward.
2 questions. One in the equity tool, one on priority actions. On the priority actions, I think that's a great idea to go through from 2014 because there's certain things that, for example, like the one-to-one policy wasn't expanded. Some of those investments may no longer be good, or other technology issues, and I would like to go through them. I think that's a very good idea and resources.
I'm sorry, you're saying one-to-one devices?
Yes.
Okay.
I thought that was interesting. I think the saving of 17 million, I think that's definitely worth working, and I would look forward to doing so. My second question is on the equity tool. Do we use it for absolutely every decision? How do we determine when? For example, like, I'm just using an example. And that would be on the Holzman vote, we didn't use it. On other votes, we do use it. How do we determine when it should be used? Because I want to include, I don't want any group to feel that their view is not included or not supported. So how do we best use it? And I feel that you're the best one to tell us of that.
I actually think this is a decision largely up for the board. I mean, the equity tool was created for board decision making and for kind of our analysis together as a team. And so certainly it would be up to the board as we're continuing our discussions on these individual decision basis to be moving forward with when you would want the equity tool analysis, kind of attached
Because I think
to
it'd be
the
helpful.
overall discussion. Yeah, that's fair.
I'm just curious when.
So, thank you, Kelly, for bringing this back to us. I know when we last talked, as a board, equity, using the equity tool really came up as a priority in our budget goals. So I appreciate you laying down the process and the framework of getting us started. I think my biggest goal here is oftentimes we talk about equity, right, in all the time, but then when it really counts, right, and that's the money, right, that's the financial component in the budget, we forget all about that. And so I think the work that you're doing really is, in your team, is really leading us in the right direction. The board, I think, I would like to see, I think you have to use an equity strategy that really gets to the details, right? That really involves a lot of work. The board's responsibility, and I think using an equity tool or equity process, maybe does not have to be as complex, right, or take a lot of time. I think the questions that we should ask ourselves as a board when we're making decisions is there unintended consequences with this decision, right? Who will this impact in making those decisions? And I think the board has the ability to come up with a process that when we're talking about Holtzman or when we're talking about other decisions, that we always ask ourselves, does this have unintended consequences, and who does it impact the most, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that those are 2 or 3 questions that we can ask ourselves and have a discussion when we are making these decisions. I think that it would be, from my standpoint, with the administration, is when you are looking at so you talked about the equity strategies that we've come up with, or in 2014, 2015, right? And looking at those to see what's working, what's not, using the equity tool.
So every year through the budget process, they were called priority projects in the past, and then the names, kind of shifted as the strategic framework itself kind of grew. But right, so every year, the board has set forward a series of investments that often happens with a new money source coming in, or a new revenue source, or it's via repurposed funds from within, meaning we stop doing something at central office, and we've typically done that, 2 or 3 million a year even, to fund those projects. So it's not all new revenue sources.
Okay.
So that we can take on new projects and new investments into students. Mentoring programs have all started that way in the last 5 years. A lot of the family and community engagement activities and resources started that way. Community schools started that way. So there's a series of investments and projects that have started, all in light of equity, moving the strategic framework goals themselves forward. And we look at it every year as a team. Should we keep doing this? Should we stop? The equity tool itself is newer than that. So the idea is take these investments through that, and are we where we expect to be?
And I like that. And just wondered if there are any other, take away the priority projects and running it through that process, but are there any other areas of budget areas that we can cover using that racial equity tool, right? I mean, oftentimes we're looking at programs and processes that were developed maybe because of equity, right, and new priorities that we have, which is great, and I think we need to continue to assess that. But are there things that we have been doing for years that we haven't evaluated or considered? Does this have a negative impact or unintended consequences to a particular group?
There are going to be very few that aren't already driven in board policy. So as our transportation policy, right? As the board, the intention of the policy committee was such that you would review policies on an ongoing basis, and so that you could take the equity tool through the policies, and all the policies in 5 years would be evaluated and then come back. That was the original purpose of the policy committee. So if you did that, as you went through each of the policies, every one of them kind of would trigger this conversation individually. But we have very few investments that aren't tied to board policy. Our transportation policy, our 4K off-site providers, are driven by policy. So to get to anything that's not policy driven, you're at a point where you're at an immaterial dollar amount for individual items that at this point in this budget, trying to pass 2 budgets, I personally don't think right now is the time to take on just smaller items. The big items to move big rocks in the budget are policy driven.
Thank you for calling that out. I appreciate that. And I think we have to, as we're talking about policy, I think we have to consider the magnitude of that work, right? And when the board is in a position and has the capacity and the time to go through these policies and take them through a racial equity analysis. I think that has to be done sooner rather than later.
I'm always available to meet if anyone wants to talk.
Yeah, and so I mean, I think that we should just talk about what that looks like, right? I mean, I think, you know, board members, that's our primary responsibility, right? But I think we have to consider a strategy that allows for us to review the policies given you know, the restriction that we all have. I mean, we all have jobs and time around that. And so, Jane, do you have something?
Can I just add, I mean, the whole notion of reviewing the policies is a huge, huge task. And it has a lot of different layers. The first layer is that policy legal in terms of state, federal, you know, local governing kinds of things. That can be done and just be done. The next level, I think, would be what you're talking about. So if we had all of our policies at a point where we knew they were legal, they were up to date, they had the latest mandates in them and all that kind of stuff, then the work of the board could be actually taking them through that tool and adding them as we needed. So that's a discussion for later. I didn't mean to get you
I
off track.
appreciate that, Jane. I think that I would like that to have that conversation. I don't know, to really come up with a plan for the future of how we're going to tackle this, because I think, as Kelly said, it's all connected to policy. If we're not looking at our policies that have been, you know, that were written years ago by other board members who didn't have that racial equity perspective or
gender,
you know, and you know that equity lens to them. I think it's important for this board. It's an opportunity for us, right? And so, anyways, Kelly, thank you for your work and giving us a plan forward
and I understand
on
the
budget.
work and the intention, and we'll push in any area, right, that we can find and bring forward. So
Okay.
I think this is ongoing work we get to do together.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. I'm done.
I'm going to jump in and on some of the comments that you just made, because this is my final year on the board, right? And I've watched for 3 years us focus on the budget as a one-year exercise. And so every year we avoid the big rocks, as you've articulated, and we have not tackled the decisions and choices that will provide us financial flexibility to invest in the ways that we want, because we are quite a well-funded school district and we are using it in ways to fund the status quo, both instructionally as well as physically, right? We have a lot of small schools with very small classes. The shape of our city is changing and we haven't addressed the conversation around that. Our middle schools as a whole are 63% full. They're expected to fall below 60% full in the next few years. So I appreciate the comments Ananda earlier on Rimrock, but like we have a lot of small schools and we at some point need to address this discussion around, do we want to put more money into buildings or do we want to put more money into kids and instruction, which would be something to add to the policy discussion. I think all of those are multi-year discussions. None of them can be done without significant bottom-up community input and leadership. But this board needs to make some decisions around multi-year conversations to bring our budget in line with our revenues. We cannot go to referendum every 4 years. Structurally, it's not an okay thing for us to go to taxpayers every 4 years. And our budget should be falling because our enrollment is falling. So when you look at that chart earlier, right, it could be going the other way. We want to make investments, and we can and should be able to make investments in kids, but we have to be willing and able to change some of the ways that we've invested over the years, both with policy as well as from my perspective, physical space. So I don't see, and that's a bit of a rant, but I am so hopeful. Mike Berry, his parting words to us, Kelly's predecessor, was whatever you do, use this year to bring revenues in line with expenditures. And we haven't done it. So I'm hopeful that we will. I'm positive that we can. And I would love to see in our principles a commitment to pick up some of those multi-year discussions, whatever the ones are that we choose to pick up. There are a lot of levers available to us, and commit to carrying those discussions through a series of a very long, input process to do right by our kids. So just comment there.
So I appreciate your also contrasting your comment around Rimrock and the elementary schools being a lower enrollment. I do think that is a concern. It comes up often. It's something that I have heard many times before. I haven't necessarily what I haven't heard is a strategy to actually address. I do think that it's a very politicized conversation, and I hope that we are courageous enough to lean into that conversation. What I found also was interesting around your comment was, which for me makes a lot of sense, and I don't know, for some reason I felt like there was a bubble coming out of your head, Callie, saying like the multi-year sort of strategy. It's like, yes, from your perspective, why can't we have a multi-year perspective? But the board changes every year, right? And the board just changed, again this year, and we have 3 seats up this year. And what I found interesting is because somebody already brought up the Holtzman building. The Holtzman building was a strategy from a previous board, and it became a very problematic issue that was, used through a political force. And it makes it really challenging to address a strategy around eliminating rental facilities when you're trying to manage false information given to the public.
I
So
would object to the false information.
I yield my time.
Let's keep going.
I'm going to object to the false information. It wasn't false, and it's inflammatory. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do it.
Let's keep going. The discussion isn't about Holtzman. This discussion is about our budget. for
This
next
discussion
year.
is about the multi-year conversation. I am down to have a multi-year conversation. Are we down to have a multi-year conversation where we set up in such a way that it gives leverage for whoever remains on the board to continue to move forward, or do we set up every board to retract every step forward that we make?
We just watched at the beginning of tonight a totally community-led effort to change something. And our communities, I have total faith, could come up with incredibly creative ways to use the space that we have in more innovative and more fit for purpose and more efficient ways. So I think you're spot on. The reason it's so challenging is board turnover. But if the board isn't leading, if the board is empowering our enrollment areas and asking them the question, knowing that we have financial constraints and that none of us are happy with how we're serving our kids, could we do better and provide some constraints around that problem and ask for their help? I don't know. I think we could. It's no question, it's an incredibly trying conversation.
I also appreciate when I'm having the microphone and it's my time and my turn, that I'm allowed to finish my comments before anybody interrupts. And I do not need to check anybody in here because other people have done that. And this is not a personal to anyone, is what happened. And we are all of us were in a very precarious situation because of exactly what you were trying to do, which I'm in agreement for. And political forces or political agendas getting in the middle of that for interest. Again, I'm talking.
And again, there was no political agenda. I will not have disability use this political agenda. I will not have it the same way race is being used as a political agenda.
Excuse me.
Disability also will.
Excuse me, we need to get the board back on the agenda, please.
And I'm sorry, but at that meeting, the disabled and on the tape was referred to as those people. I have still not gotten an apology.
Ananda has the floor.
I'll yield my time.
Yeah, so I think getting back to the conversation around big rocks, one of the things that I have a hard time understanding mathematically, Kelly, is how equity initiatives and tools kind of fall into big rocks. So when you look at other big rocks, you're talking about 83 to 85% of our budget. $17 million doesn't come anywhere close to that. So part of what feels inequitable to me in terms of the way we frame this conversation on a regular basis is that we seem to become far more concerned with the use of resources when the majority of people who will benefit from said resources are students of color. And I've said this before in terms of our equity tool. I appreciate the equity tool. I am far more interested in our inequity tools, right? So what are we spending money on that disproportionately benefits affluent students, white students, students who our district has historically spent more resources on? The other thing is when we're talking about areas of growth, the students of color within this district is a growing demographic within the district, and so our ability to serve all students is also our ability to stay relevant as a district, and I think that is an area I'd like us to be able to speak to expansively in terms of why it's qualifying as a big rock, and
Sure. What motivates I'll use us that to as my shift. segue into my slides around the fact that we have to pass two budgets, and to Lee's point, kind of the big rocks. So in a minute, I'll talk a little bit more about revenue, but as it relates to the big rocks, the salary, $5 million out of our budget is driven entirely by the step schedule, which is built into the employee handbook, which is something the board has the ability to shift through the employee handbook committee. That process starts this summer. Base wage is a discussion this board will take on through this budgeting process, and could be something I suppose you could take through the equity tool, being that base wage is typically universally applied. That would be up to the board's decision if you wanted to non-universally apply it, but typically that is not the way we apply base wage. The staffing plan is driven largely by that class size policy that I mentioned. The class size policy is the policy the board has in place for allocating resources today. If the board wanted to take on revising the class size policy for the future, certainly you could. The policies and practices that we have in that policy don't have to be the same, and certainly other districts don't do it exactly the way we do, and could be work that this board takes on. The employee benefits plan is conversation that we'll bring back in March. Healthcare plans won't even start negotiations with us quite yet because they use the previous year's ending data. So they're probably all analyzing it right now, just like we are. As it relates to our employees' benefit plan, what I would say as it relates to equity is we have a strategy where we provide full health care to part-time employees. And that is a costly endeavor, but an equity strategy that the board put in place many, many years ago that has been very supportive to our part-time employees, often who are also our parents. So it's an embedded equity strategy that is extremely expensive for us. But that is a part of our employee benefit package, is that full health care plan for part-time employees.
And what is part-time? What is the minimum part-time? Is that 20 or?
It's 19 hours. That triggers the healthcare plan is 19 hours. That I mentioned the strategic equity actions already. And then our required allowances, unfortunately, are things we can't much control. And those are bills that we have to pay one way or another. So as I move forward in trying to plan these two kind of budgets moving forward, the does not pass and the passes budget, I've already gone through this slide in the previous presentation, but as it relates to our revenue strategy, our revenue forecast for this upcoming year, there is $0 in per pupil categorical aid this year. There has been an investment at the state level all the way back to 2010 in per pupil categorical aid. And we see a 0 this year. And as a matter of fact, the budget language specifically says 0 in 2021 and every year thereafter. And that is a clear signal at the state level that it is no longer a tool that will be used. Not surprising for those of us who are paying attention, because it's probably what never was a sustainable revenue source. Instead, the state's going back to the revenue limit, and we saw that this year when they gave us $175 per pupil, which, as you look at the prior years, is nowhere near what we were even getting per pupil back in 1993, right? We're $200 and up every year until 210. So we saw 175 this year, and we see 179 next year. But the big difference is the fact that the per pupil categorical aid is a big zero. So you guys spent a lot of time talking about student enrollment. Here are my main talking points about that, and hoping we don't get too far off scope here. We're looking at about 51 overall fewer students this year. That will certainly be accounted for in our overall FTE reduction, as it was last year. The reasons these next couple years are lower are entirely driven by lower birth rates. We have had lower birth rates kind of coming out of the recession, and some smaller classes going through the system. When you look at the longer term projection than just this 4 years, and maybe I should have put that in here, better anticipating this conversation, but it comes back up. So what we shouldn't be doing is making short-term decisions or long-term decisions based on short-term trends. And I think that's what the paper's article really missed. The last article we saw on this is the fact that the long term, we're adding 1,000 kids back in. We've got the west side building up now with bulldozers and cornfields. If we miss that, we've missed the boat. And we almost missed the boat on the south side strategy. We're probably in our last year to move on that and not lose those kids. We have to be proactive and not reactive. And what I wouldn't want the board to do is to make big, large kind of swings based on short-term trends. It has to be taken into a full picture. Yes, we will change FTE based on the students that we lose in the next couple of years. That's our short-term lever. We can reduce staff. Certainly, we need to be looking at Lindbergh. We know that. We know that in the next few years, we need to talk about the enrollment levels at Lindbergh. And that's been in the ether, and we're not missing that. But we want to be super careful because the capacity at our middle schools we're going to need. And we need more capacity at Memorial, and we need more capacity at West. So I just want to be really careful that these broad statements that we're making don't get overstated. So I take that into the 3-year membership average because that's slightly different than our enrollment based on the way that we're funded. So the blue bar kind of correlates with what you just saw on the previous slide. Those are the kiddos that are in our seats that we're planning for. We do add a third 2X charter program that we have to, our school, that we have to plan for next year.
Is that Arbor or is that a different?
No, Arbor was turned down. A Democratic Milestone is the third 2X charter that is planned to be open for the 2021 school year. It's a high school. It's a high school not so dissimilarly designed as Capitol High. Very matter of fact, they're using a lot of the same curriculum resources that we are. Very similar. And they're starting with 60 FTE, largely kind of like targeting enrollment in the La Follette attendance area. So that is embedded into our calculations for this coming year as well, and it's one of the reasons why the required allowances is a little higher than I previously estimated.
Hey, where's the site? Where's the site?
They have not announced their site yet.
But it's in the La Follette area.
We know that by their planning, they're targeting La Follette students. I do not know where their site is right now.
East or south?
I don't believe they've announced it yet.
Sorry, but to your point about not reacting to short-term trends, you know, we have an amazing document that projects the district's growth over the next 20 years, and it does project that, you know, we dip a little bit and then we stabilize. And, you know, I think we've talked about this, but, you know, getting a top to bottom analysis of current vacant space in our buildings and what it can be compatible for in terms of usage.
Yeah.
I think is really relevant to make
Yeah.
our capital budget talk more to
Yeah.
our operational
And
budget.
just to be clear, we should be making short-term decisions.
Oh.
But I want to be careful about like closing a building is a long-term decision.
Right, yeah.
And so we need to be having the discussions, but I just want to make sure our decision-making is like set long-term trends, long-term decisions, short-term trends, short-term decisions. So as it relates to our revenue, the $179 per pupil drives about $4.8 million of new revenue. The increase in categorical aid that's in the budget for this year, we're getting closer to being able to kind of analyze that since some of the December data from this last year came in. We're looking at an estimated $2.8 million. Now that will be money that will, it's a reimbursable money, so we'll get it. So we can budget for it this year. But once it's in our budget, it's not coming back year after year, right? It's not $3 million new every year. Because we got a bump in aid one year, we'll get to see this money this coming year, but you won't see it again in 21, 22, unless the state would increase the reimbursement rate again. And then on the revenue limit side, I've already mentioned this, the 2016 operating referendum anticipated, we are out of additional authority for 2021. If the board goes to operating referendum, right now, I'm kind of doing our budget based on a scenario where the board would go to $8 million, which is what we took out to the community, or scenarios where maybe the board is at $5 million. Giving you room to do your work over the next couple months before you decide in March where you want that number to land. For my planning purposes, I'm kind of hedging my bets and theoretically running 3 budgets so that I've got plans moving forward based on whatever it is you all decide to vote on in March. Mill rates, always super important to talk about at this time because the decisions that we start to build in the budget affects the mill rate and ultimately affects property tax owners. So if we were not to go to operating, you're looking at the mill rate falling. We're at $11.10 right now, so falling to $10.87 over a 2% reduction. And then you're looking at the passing budget. If you're in an $8 million scenario, the levy for this is just operating, facilities is not included in this, increasing to $11.13, or an increase of kind of 0.24% in just this 1 year look. If you're at $5 million, the mill rate would actually still decrease to about $11.03.
Increase or decrease?
Decrease, sorry. Thank you. So, if those are our revenue scenarios, what are kind of the assumptions we start to build a budget around so that we can get to work? This board, back in November, set forward a strategy to fully fund steps and lanes. So I'm making the assumption that that's in there on both budgets. For base wage, in a non-passing budget, I do not see a scenario where we can get to base wage to the max on the non-passing budget. We've pushed kind of the limits in our assumptions, and we think the max we can get to is 1% on the does not pass budget, which is double what we entered this time of year on the base wage last year, because that was 0.5. In the passing budget, we fund base wage to the max as an assumption in the budget. Based on enrollment trends and the use of our class size policy, tied to the goals of ensuring that we aren't below the minimum class size policies, and using the class size policy itself, we're looking at a $3 million reduction in staffing. But that's for district and schools. $1 million of that, I've got targeted to central office reductions. So there's work that Lisa, Deirdre, and I are doing with the senior leadership team to reach the $1 million goal of reductions at central office. Clutch to this plan coming through to balance the does not pass budget would mean that the employee benefits plans would need to stay at a $0 increase. So in order to do that, we have to work with our MTA partners at the negotiating table come February, and we negotiate as hard as we can with the healthcare providers themselves to get our increases down to 0%. That's our goal. If we can't get there, we would have to look at plan design and or employee percentage contribution to get to 0. So ensuring that we stay at $0 this year is one of kind of the key strategies to making sure we can pass this budget. On the strategic equity project side, I've got $1 million held for the investments that the board has already, in the last budget cycle, committed to for some multi-year strategies. We'll talk about that more in the March-April timeframe as well. In the passing budget, I put $2 million for additional equity investments related to specific new projects that the board would want to take on. I mentioned required allowances. We're estimating $2.6 million will be needed between the 2X charters, open enrollment, the 4K providers, etc. And then you'll notice at the bottom end of the does not pass budget that to get the does not pass budget, in addition to the $1 million of reductions at central office that we would need to be looking at, we're looking at another $800,000 of non-personnel reductions coming from kind of the central office side that we would need to be meeting as well just to pass that budget. One more slide, and then I'll come back to this. So to sum it up, the key strategies in the does not pass budget are this. 1% for base wage. With steps and lanes, the total compensation plan is then 3%. That is above the cost of living increase in total in the steps and lanes, or in the steps and base added together. Between central office and schools, you're looking at about 35 to 45 FTE reduction. But again, $1 million of that, or at between 8 and 10 FTE coming from central office. Healthcare plan at 0. And $1 million in at the strategic equity project level. Those 4 kind of talking points, I guess, are the key rocks to getting the non-passing budget balanced.
Question on footnote. On the CPI for July 1st contract is not available, does that mean we can't tell till after July 1st?
In April is when the state releases those numbers, Nikki.
Okay.
They release the number in April's, but there are a lot of really smart people who project those rates and are pretty gosh darn close from year to year, just forecasting trends and things. 1.8% is our current estimate of where we'll be when they announce it in April. Could be up 0.1, could be down 0.1. We'll be right in that zone.
Okay. That's the only question I had, otherwise you're making a budget person out of me. It's actually clear, and that's saying something.
Thank you.
Discussion.
Yep.
Chris.
I just have a few questions, one of which might provoke some discussion. First, going back to enrollment, I appreciate your making us the slide of the 3-year averages, adding in the charter school enrollment. I'm wondering if we could also, at some point, get a sense of how open enrollment is projected to affect that. I know we don't know, but we know we have a new school going in. It gets back to what Kate talked about. You know, do we anticipate there could be an increase in open enrollment?
Yeah, so
your averages that could actually
Oregon School won't
change
be
things.
open like this fall. So for this particular budget, the open enrollment estimate is pretty flat. The rate of open enrollment went up almost double what our revenue limit percentage went up for this current school year. So we have to account for the fact that the open enrollment rate went up on us. But the actual number of FTE is actually predicted to be pretty stable. The year out is when we got a couple elementary schools, not only in Oregon, but out in Middleton as well.
And that's actually what I'm wondering about, is projecting, and I know we're looking at rolling averages, but projecting out, do we need to start thinking about a longer term impact from open enrollment?
Yeah.
I also think, again, not this year, but a longer term thought project would be if we were to move to full day 4K, and if the state were to actually start reimbursing for such a thing, how could that have a positive impact on enrollment? I know when we started half day full K, it did make a substantial impact on our enrollment, and I think starting to be proactive in terms of 4K with the anticipation that hopefully we'll get there with the state in terms of how they count FTE for early childhood education could actually benefit us budgetarily.
Absolutely. Yeah, if the state were to, if some of the plans that are kind of in the ether at the state level start to get traction, it absolutely benefits us here in Madison.
My second clarification, I guess, is around I think it gets to the operating referendum ask. Like you had, when we originally talked about going to the voters for 8 million this fall, you had not built in the 2.8 million for categorical aid for special education, correct?
Our estimate was not this high, correct?
So, right. So at that time, the budget shortfall we were looking at is now about 3 million less because we have this new categorical aid that we hadn't talked about when we first were talking about going to the voters for 8 million.
Yeah,
Is
about
that
2
correct?
million. So we were in the kind of 8 to 10 range, and now we're in kind of like the 6 to 8 range. So, what I'm saying is we can get to the 5 if that's where the board wants to make some of the tough decisions on efficiencies. We can get to 5, and then adding kind of the 2 million for the special ed categorical aid, which is just a 1 year.
Right.
It doesn't help us for 21, 22, or any year forward. Because once it's like a one time.
But the flip side of that is if putting that savings into the operating referendum this year, it carries across all 4 years. It
Absolutely.
lowers the amount that we're asking the taxpayers for.
Yeah.
It's pretty substantially, so I think we should
that's
we
the
should
right
take
way to
that
think about
seriously,
it.
and it's not as painful as it looks at the surface to go down that extra 3 million because we're getting the categorical aid.
Correct.
And finally, in just looking at the slide where you have the budgets for if the operating referendum passes and if the operating referendum does not pass, if it does not pass, I think it's just painful and where we're at. If it does pass, I'm wondering if we could put in a little bit of flexibility somehow on employee benefits if we're not actually able to negotiate as aggressively as we hope to with our benefit providers. If we could somehow make that a 0 to 1 million thing and take $1 million out of something else to make that happen. I like that we're going to, getting people our base wage, but if the whole base wage is consumed by health insurance increases, it doesn't actually help that much. So I'm just wondering if we could try, could we say that our strategic equity project, for instance, we're going to aim for 2 to 3 million and employee benefits will aim for 0 to 1 million and look at that fluidly. Like it may turn out that it makes sense to keep that at 0 and it makes sense to keep strategic equity at 3, but give ourselves just a little bit of flexibility with the unknowns in this process.
You want to just give ranges?
Yeah, just give us a range, and just for those, mostly for the health insurance, just to give ourselves some options because we just don't know what the health insurance companies are going to come to us with.
Yeah, I mean, if that's where the board wants to head, that's work we can do.
Is that just, can you play that out logistically? Because
Yeah,
the
logistic-
meeting would be done in the spring and the decision, usually there's a lot of communication ahead of time around
That's right.
changes. et
Yeah. So logistically and communication wise, yes, I think it would be extremely difficult. And the HR team was here, they would say, if we put the employee percentage, if you decide to put employee percentage contribution into does not pass budget, it carries through because you implement that, kind of on July 1 typically. Or if you if you decide to make a plan design change, you make that plan design change. You don't, reverse it in November for all kinds of reasons, not even just logistical and communication. So it's difficult to do by all means. But when we're in March, we haven't yet, voted on the budget. And I think that'd be the best time to kind of air out the pros and cons of that particular strategy versus trying to do that tonight.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I greatly appreciate, Chris, you bringing us to a space talking about 4K and the potential of 4K to both use vacant space and also, create a better budget overall and also create profound advantages in terms of learning opportunities in early childhood. Like that's kind of like the ultimate win-win, and I think in the long term we will get there, and I think that is a good thing to maintain our focus on. I do think the last time we had this conversation, I think it's relevant to bring up the fact that I do have a conflict of interest and there's a series of big rocks that I'm not going to talk about. But I think that we had this conversation and we did go around and ask folks to be pretty specific in terms of where their areas of focus were. So I greatly appreciate that you brought us back to the conversation on benefits, because it was identified at that meeting as one of the big rocks that folks had greater flexibility for or weren't putting at the top two of their priorities. And so I think anything that lends itself to where we have flexibility, and we have just, I mean, we did this recently in terms of going from 3 providers to 2 providers, and the cost savings involved in that. I think anything that demonstrates that kind of long-term cost savings and efficiency, and also allows for us to utilize the full weight of the organization in terms of bargaining power and potential, is really relevant to this conversation.
Yeah. 2 points. Yeah, I'm excited about the 4K conversation. Put my other hat for a minute around community development. I know that there is multiple areas in our community where there's a desert of in high need of 4K or early childhood programs in general, and curious of what would if some of that has some connection to some of the the not fully utilized spaces that we currently have around elementary. But what I wanted to ask you, Kelly, was because I remember in 2016 there was some change in how we employees paid benefits. Can you, so the 0 there is 0 for all, can you explain to us, like, what is that scaffolding of who pays no benefits, and how does that happen for NUPS and for administration?
Yeah, so at this point, most everybody pays employee percentage contribution. But the board at the time, when they had to increase, it used to be 0, right? Everybody paid 0. And our budget could not sustain, especially with those big dips that you saw on the earlier slide. And so the board strategy was to add an employee percentage contribution. But what they decided to do from an equity lens was to scaffold it. So the higher paid salary levels paid a higher percentage. And then as you went down the ranks, it gets lower. So it's as low as kind of, I think it's 1.25% for some of our lower paid staffing. There's like a 2% category, 5% category, all the way up to administrators who pay 10.
And then the administrators pay 10.
Administrators pay 10.
And then that's how it's due to this day.
Correct. So that hasn't changed. Like that has been that percentage has not changed since that 15 year, just before we went to that operating referendum. So if we were to have to do anything, we would look at that same kind of scaffolding level.
That was the only comments that I was gonna say, is that if we're gonna look at a range of in that line, is that we're following the same, where the people that make the least amount of money in the district actually has a much lower percentage. Yeah.
So by the time we get to March and April, those would be some of the ideas and options that go into.
Right, thank you.
So, thank you for this very thorough presentation. You know, you and I have talked about the potential for an all-day 4K pilot and how important that can be for not only our kids in the district, but families as an economic burden. And this question might come out of left field, but do you think we're doing all we can to help teachers and educators take care of student loan debt refinancing in terms of helping increase their, earning power or, their income?
I don't know that I have an opinion one way or another to answer that. Our HR team has supports for teachers in all kinds of areas, and that being one of them. We have like a employee service center, the employee assistance line, and that is one of the areas. But I don't have an opinion as to whether we're doing the best we can. We are doing
something. Okay, all right, thank you.
I'm gonna jump in with just a last comment if nobody else has any. Kelly, you had asked for feedback around the kind of 5 to 8 million. A lot of this presentation is built around a range of referendum asks. And I just wanted to maybe build on Chris's earlier comment that I would very strongly push to present a referendum at the lower level. I actually would be curious about even pushing lower than 5. You have 2 budgets here, both of which work, and one of them requires 0. And so I just wanted to reinforce at least landing on the kind of 5 level, but I certainly would be comfortable even somewhat lower than that in year 1, given the information that you've shared here. So.
Can we go around? Because
let's do like a one sentence go around on that and then move on.
Yeah,
So.
I mean, I think that I'm very much in support of the facilities referendum. Operating does make me nervous. I think it does set us back. I'm really leaning towards if we are going to do an operating, is doing it at the lower level and even go lower than the 5. That's where I'm at.
I'm comfortable with going down to 5 in year 1 because of the additional special education. Did it die? Oh, sorry. I'm comfortable with going down to 5 million in year 1 because of the additional special education categorical aid we'll be receiving. I'm not really comfortable going below 5 though.
I'm not convinced that the lowest range, the 5 is where we should be. I do think that we should talk about lower than the 8, but I wouldn't go as low as 8, and definitely for sustainability the subsequent years.
Yeah, I'm comfortable going down to 5 because of the additional categorical aid, and we have a structural deficit that we have to grapple with. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I thought I was something, and I realized it after I said it, so I'm sorry. Very simply, I am not comfortable going under 5. I could go 6, I could see myself going 6. I do appreciate the categorical aid. To me, the operating budget is going to be more important to me than the facilities budget. Losing 100 FTE, I think, will end up harming us as a school. As much as I want to do, as much as I believe our students deserve the best, and I do, I don't want to lose the teachers or our commitment to try and increase diversity in teaching, and I'm afraid it will do both of those.
Ali.
So the question was?
A lot of this presentation has been built around a range of 5 to 8 or for the operating referendum, and Kelly had asked for feedback on what scenario to keep building. So
I think it's our job to make the expense to the taxpayer as little as possible. And so I think that, we have to weigh two really important elements, which is one, how do we produce the greatest possible outcomes for our young people? And I think that means resourcing their schools really well. And I don't think that there's a bare minimum approach that we can take that's effective. I think that, I think in weighing that, I think we land somewhere between 6 and 8 in my opinion. But I think I'm open to ongoing conversation around what it would look like to come in at 5.
So I think
Kelly.
that's super helpful from your planning, so thank you. And as it relates to the board's work, kind of on the referendum and getting yourself ready as you're, kind of doing your constituency work and what that looks like over the next couple of months. I'm hoping that helps even get this a little more, concrete for the board as a whole. To get ready for the March vote. So I'll be working, on this strategy on the budget end as you're continuing to work on your referendum strategy to get ready for the March vote as well. So that then maybe leads to the next kind of obvious question before we close that out. is if we're gonna be looking in something like a $6 million, scenario on the passing, and we know what our scenario is on the revenue side on the does not pass, is this a plan that I can move forward on? I hear Chris's comment about holding this question for healthcare versus strategic equity projects. Like, I got you on that, we'll open that back up in March. But like, with that known, is this moving forward with my team? Because we get to real heavy work at this point, moving forward.
You want to do a reverse go around really quick? Just.
I'm sorry,
So Kelly's asking, are we comfortable with the assumptions she's using for building these budgets outside? So healthcare, base wage, steps and lanes. What else? I can't read that far away. So.
Behind you.
And the overall FTE strategy.
So you're looking for a confirmation that those
These are the four.
that those assumptions are something that we can support when the budget comes back to us.
Yeah. It sounds like at least the majority of us are comfortable with going down to 5, want some flexibility between strategic equity and benefits. It's kind of the consensus I'm gathering.
Just go around, yeah.
Yeah. That's where I'm at.
We're going this way or
See, we're just gonna go in this way.
I'm not quite comfortable with the low 5, but it's not what you're
So
asking.
this is,
You're asking.
this is the does not pass budget.
Okay.
So this is the budget based on the revenue we know, operating referendum either doesn't go or
The yellow
doesn't
line.
pass. 1% base wage.
Okay.
$3 million reduction in FTE, which is about 35 to 45 FTE, depending on how all things play out. $1 million of that, again, is central office kind of reductions based on our current estimates. The 0 on healthcare, leaving $1 million for strategic equities in a non-passing budget.
Okay. Yes.
I'm also comfortable with this. For the reduction in FTE, however, I would like to have a future conversation about trying to protect staffing in our schools as much as we can, as well as try to minimize classes going above the class size policy maximum as much as we can.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely, yeah. I guess this is not a place that I would want to be, right? I don't want to lose 35 to 45, right? I mean, this is not the best case scenario, and I think that is, that's where the board is at. I mean, I think the board, we are at this space having to make this difficult decision based on decisions that were made in the past. And now we are in a position to make this difficult decision, right, if it doesn't. And so I just want to make that clear that this is not the best case scenario at all. And this board has been left to this difficult decision based on what has been done. And so, and I think we have to be mindful of how our decisions impact our taxpayers and being fiscally responsible as we move forward. And as Kate said, we can't go back to our taxpayers every 4 years. We have to be able as a board and also set an agenda for future boards on how to manage our current capacity. And it's just really disheartening to me that we're at this place and we're being left with this potential decision of losing staff, and it's not ideal at all. This is not a place I would have wanted to be in, and it's very unfortunate. And so, given the place that we are at now, that is why I have to support an operating referendum, because I just don't want to see this happen. And so, yeah.
I support, oh, sorry, I didn't know. I thought you were going. I can't get it to go on. Here. I support a operating referendum. I am not completely comfortable with this situation and so therefore, as much as I would like to, I cannot say I'm comfortable with it. I know I'm in the
So
minority.
Nikki, what would you move around?
That's the problem, I haven't gotten there yet. I'm still working through the numbers in my brain. So is there a way that I could text you in 24 hours? I honestly am one of those people who need to sleep on it.
Yeah, let's
Rework.
meet, but I do need to know
Absolutely.
how you would balance the budget.
Oh,
That's really important.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I just want to run the numbers through my brain. Think, that's some hot chocolate. Think more, and then get an answer.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think what we demonstrate within the options is that there's a clear need for the equitable referendum. And I think to say that we're comfortable with both is a stretch. I think our ability to face the reality of our, our expenses and our revenue, it is part of our job. And so I think what you've put together allows for us to be informed and responsible moving forward. It allows for us to demonstrate a clear need to our community in terms of operating. And I don't think we could have two ideal budgets or we would not go to referendum. So I think that there's a little desire to say, like, why can't we have everything all the time? And I think that is weird. And so I greatly appreciate the work that you've put into this. I am not able to speak to the vast majority of Large Rocks, and I think that kind of positions me to speak most impactfully about that.
So I'm just going to close out and say, look, this is a Plan B budget. It's not any of our Plan A's. And we can remind ourselves we have a community that is deeply supportive of public education. We reminded ourselves of that earlier tonight with feedback from our school community. We've heard that from our city community. And so it's a Plan B budget, but it does need to be built. So. Okay. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you, Savion. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? We are adjourned.
Do we have a closed session?
We do.